Internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a Black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
As the tension over the flag continues, a statue of Ben Tillman on the State House grounds was vandalized today. Red paint could be seen on the side of the statue, but it's unclear when the vandalism actually took place. Tillman, a noted white supremacist, spent 3 decades from 1890 through 1918 as governor and as a U.S. senator here in South Carolina. Workers spent the afternoon cleaning the statue. The act of vandalism is now under investigation.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade, Justice in for another program, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, July 3rd, 2015. So I have been told this is our second study session on Stephen Kantrowitz, his biography on the former governor, former U.S. senator, founder of Clemson University, and proud anti-black terrorist Ben Tillman. We are picking up on page 31, the book title again, Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. We have a lot of reading to do, so we will get started. Context of White Supremacy, Ben Tillman.
By the late 1850s, a shared interest in defending slaveholders' rights united much of the upcountry and low country behind pro-slavery expansionism. Planters themselves moved outward in many directions. George Tillman, fleeing prosecution for murder, had headed south to join William Walker's pro-slavery filibuster army in Central America. Another Tillman brother, Oliver, moved to the cotton frontier of Florida in 1858. In the middle years of the decade, Edgefield readers could closely follow the progress of local companies of immigrants sent to Kansas to challenge free soil settlement. In the 1850s, as Ben Tillman learned to read and interpret developments in the larger world, he saw his society mobilizing its young men in a broad campaign to make the world safe for slavery. The lessons he learned concerned personal self-assertion as well as collective defiance. Only 2 months before George Tillman killed J.H. Christian, Edgefield citizens had reacted quite differently to another brutal attack, this one perpetrated by native son U.S. Congressman Preston Brooks against anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner. In a speech on the Kansas question, Sumner had made derisive references to South Carolina's U.S. Senator A.P. Butler and his harlot slavery. These slights had enraged Brooks, Butler's young relation. The Edgefield representative had fumed, lain in wait, and finally accosted Sumner at his Senate desk, beating him senseless with a cane. Brooks' attack on Sumner, like Tillman's on Christian, certainly did not demonstrate the mutual respect due white male equals. But Brooks, unlike Tillman, required no forgiveness from his fellow South Carolinians. He was defending his relative, his state, and a crucial institution against a man whose commitment to abolition placed him outside the bounds of Southern white male solidarity. To have challenged Sumner to a duel which the Northerner would surely have refused would have been to acknowledge him as a social equal. Instead, like a rebellious slave, Sumner deserved a beating he would never forget. Sectional mistrust reached a climax with John Brown's raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859. Brown's attempt to instigate an abolitionist revolution and his contacts with prominent anti-slavery Northerners confirmed South Carolina planters' worst fears about their opponents. The Edgefield Advertiser dubbed the perpetrators a pack of crazy fanatics and poor, deluded slaves, but the newspaper proved only slightly less susceptible to panic than its peers throughout the slave South. At Brown's execution in December, amid widespread fears of militant abolitionist retaliation, the editor felt compelled to dispel rumors that the governor of Virginia had asked South Carolina to furnish substantial aid to her northern frontier. The danger, however, might be much closer at hand. Any space not fully under the surveillance and control of the planter class could present a threat. For instance, the local market center of Augusta and its concentration of people outside the slaveholders' immediate orbit. James Henry Hammond warned his fellow agricultural reformers at a December 1959 meeting that there are now more abolitionists in Augusta than took Harper's Ferry. If an insurrection should break out about here, Augusta would be the place. The Negroes' churches of such cities presented the greatest danger, for they could easily be converted from religious into military organizations. He believed slaves could, if they chose, burn Augusta and Savannah within a month, and if the Northern men knew as much as he did, it would be done. Hammond's proposed remedy, a full reorganization of the patrol system, met with wide agreement. From late 1859 onward, a drumbeat of martial mobilization began that would scarcely pause for another 5 years. In wave after wave of enrollments, volunteer companies, state militia units like the Edgefield Riflemen, as well as local Minutemen's associations, prepared to stand against federal intrusion, abolitionist agents, and the slave revolt abolitionists seemed determined to inspire. The growing support among Northern voters for the party known in South Carolina as the Black Republicans suggested that many Northerners intended the violent destruction of Southern civilization. To secessionists, however, the rise of the Republicans had the virtue of clarifying sectional politics. If a Republican became president, surely Southern voters would understand that they were safer out of the Union than in it. Although South Carolina selected its presidential electors by vote of the General Assembly, the federal election witnessed popular demonstrations and military mobilization. Secessionists organized militias all through the Cotton Piedmont. A few weeks after Lincoln's election, the planters of the Saluda region of Edgefield formed their own company of Minutemen, and by their second meeting, they had enrolled nearly 50 members. Ben Tillman watched as several thousand Minutemen wearing sashes of red calico torn into strips paraded in Hamburg. He heard an impassioned speech on behalf of secession. He remembered the martial fantasies traded by George Tillman and his friend and fellow lawyer Martin Gary as they brought Ben home from a secession demonstration. The contempt with which both of them spoke of the Yankees impressed my young mind with the then prevalent opinion amongst the Southern people that all the courage was in the South and all the cowardice in the North. Moments of crisis and the solidarity they engendered could temporarily obscure slave-holding society's fissures and tensions. Mobilization created a sense of shared struggle, and the white men who served together reinforced their solidarity as the patriarchal rulers of a racially hierarchical society. Tillman remembered with what ardor and impassioned patriotism the war spirit was fanned into flame. but he also understood the repressive dimension of this mobilization. There were no Union men at all, he explained. If there were, they kept silent. Yet support for the Confederacy was shaped by the same competing forces that had defined the antebellum South. Appeals to Southern rights obscured the fact that most supporters of secession understood their interests as essentially local and only secondarily regional. Their loyalties were to their families, their plantations, and their communities and their states, generally in that order. Rhetoric to the contrary, defense of a unitary South, generally placed a distant fifth. Hence, when the leaders of the Saluda Minutemen proposed on December 15, 1860, that the group offered its services to the governor, only 33 of 74 men assented. A week later, 2 days after the convention in Charleston had passed the Ordinance of Secession, just 2 more Minutemen added their names to that list. The remaining men had signed on in defense of their household authority. It would take more than patriotic speeches to make them march away from that sacred terrain. When the Charleston batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter and Lincoln called for volunteers to put down the rebellion, the call to defend Southern soil against invasion inspired many white men. But even this threat left many others unpersuaded that they should march north to take up the fight. As late as May 1861, many members of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers refused to follow their colonel to the camps of Virginia. "We never dreamed of leaving our own state," one explained. In some parts of the South, such reluctance threatened secession itself. South Carolina's convention voted to leave the Union on the 20th of December, and by early February, 6 lower South states had followed suit. For secessionists in 4 more slave states, it took Lincoln's call for volunteers after the fall of Fort Sumter to propel their states into the new Confederacy, whereas in the 4 border slave states, secession faltered. Throughout the South, White Belt Unionists demanded that secession follow democratic principles, and secessionist elites resorted to preemptive and often violent coercion. In many areas, secession amounted to a coup d'etat against anti-secessionist majorities. Throughout the war, White Belt regions of the Confederacy, especially along the slaveholding republic's Appalachian spine, would resist state and national claims on their goods, bodies, and loyalties, making some areas practically ungovernable by Confederate authorities and creating a new free soil state out of Virginia's western counties. In South Carolina, however, such men found themselves particularly isolated. A decade earlier, they had made bitter jokes comparing themselves to slaves, but now Unionists were simply bitter. As Unionist James Pettigrew lamented, South Carolina was too small for a republic, but too large for a lunatic asylum. Destroying slavery in order to save it. Secession and war in South Carolina revealed the continuing tension between a political culture of white male solidarity and a political economy in which a few men possessed most of the wealth. By the end of the war, well over 2,000 men, more than 3/5 of Edgefield's eligible white male population, would serve. Most of these were volunteers. The Edgefield Advertiser had hardly exaggerated when it claimed in early 1861 that there will be no drafting in Edgefield. Volunteers generally elected their own company officers in keeping with a long-standing militia practice, but this democratic mass mobilization coexisted with displays of aristocratic power. Since militiamen frequently provided their own equipment, at first the burden of equipping a Southern rights army fell to those whose rights had made them the wealthiest. Wade Hampton himself paid for the cannon of the regiment he commanded, which was known as Hamptons Legion. The regiment included the Edgefield Hussars, enlisted as a cavalry company under the well-connected young planter Matthew Butler, as well as an infantry company commanded by George Tillman's friend Martin Gary. The mobilization, at least momentarily, undid the political rivalries of the previous decade. Tillman Watson, a former congressman who, until recently, had been the local cooperationist leader, sponsored Gary's infantry company. George Tillman, although he was Gary's bosom friend and fellow secessionist, had recently married and did not immediately enlist. But he, like the others who served, knew that there would be no political future in South Carolina for a white man of fighting age who did not eventually wear the gray. Ben Tillman, 13 years old at secession, did not expect to don a uniform for some time, and life continued much as it had for the children of the planter class. During 1861 and 1862, he split time between living on the family plantation and attending a nearby school. He received news of the Civil War from newspapers, local gossip, and letters from his family. Fears for the health and safety of his brother James, only 5 years his senior, percolated through his correspondence, and the recent deaths of 3 of his brothers may have given a special charge to his own fantasies about death in battle. 2 weeks after his 15th birthday, Ben wrote to his sister Anna about Charlie Jackson, a 15-year-old Memphis boy who had been mortally wounded at Corinth. Charlie, Tillman wrote, had told his father, "I am not afraid to die. Tell the boys when you get back how I died, just as a soldier ought to." This account of a young protagonist bravely mastering war and death, making an exemplary passage into the next world, was exactly the kind of story the men of the planter class loved to tell about themselves. The rhetoric of heroism, like that of paternalism, made brutal realities, in this case the repeated decimation of a generation of young white men, more bearable. But martial fantasies, like paternalism, played out somewhat less smoothly in practice, as Tillman imagined transcending boyhood by bearing arms in service to his nation. A movement was afoot among the white parents of Edgefield to prevent their sons from carrying concealed weapons to school. Some clearly shared the concerns the elder Benjamin Tillman had articulated years before. If the sons of slaveholders were not denied this mischievous privilege, the Edgefield Advertiser feared the result would be rowdyism and bloodshed. Slaveholders in the infant Confederacy anxiously insisted that slaves would validate their paternalist pretensions. Under the heading, "The Faithful Negro," the Edgefield Advertiser declared that the South has no better friend in her troubles than the everlasting nigger. As this wicked war upon us progresses, they catch up more and more of the Southern fire and stand but the more firmly at the posts of duty. A few column inches away, however, the anxieties of the previous decade could be seen creeping back in. Was it true, the editor asked cautiously, that local blacks continue to trade in what is not their own? Tillman spent the early years of the war as a schoolboy, but even here the lessons he remembered years later were those that represented proper manly independence. A schoolmistress ordered him to sit on a sooty andiron, and when he refused, she beat him with a switch. He appeased her by appearing to sit, but he did not touch his breeches to the metal, thus submitting only in appearance. He played games with other boys, fished, swam, and hunted squirrels and rabbits. And he read whatever he could get his hands on, magazines, popular fiction, and especially the novels of Walter Scott. The absence of so many white men strained the slaveholding order in unexpected ways and revealed that women and slaves had much to teach a young white man. As the oldest white male on the family plantation, Ben had to learn the agricultural skills and negotiations that life as an adult and a slaveholder would require of him. He spent much of 1863 collecting money owed to his mother and paying off debts amassed by his brother John. But Sophia Tillman could not supervise everything, and she appears to have entrusted Tillman's economic education to a slave named Stan. Together, the black man and the white boy took butter, eggs, and fruit to market in Augusta and conducted business at grist and textile mills. By law, Stan was in Tillman's charge, but it was the slave, not the master, who knew how to accomplish these tasks. Tillman remembered Stan as very ambitious, with far more sense than is usual among Negroes. A backhanded acknowledgement that the older man had taught him how to make his way in the marketplace. Unable to admit this inappropriate relation of teacher and student, an older Ben Tillman perhaps felt compelled to minimize how much he had learned from a slave. Well before the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves took advantage of the war. When the Union occupation of South Carolina's coast began in late 1861, most Union officials had no intention of freeing the slaves they found there. To their surprise and discomfiture, black men and women pressed the issue, forcing Northern soldiers to acknowledge them as human beings with valuable information, crucial skills, and bodies that could work and fight. Hundreds of thousands of black men served by war's end, first as military laborers, then as soldiers, providing myriad tests of Georgia Confederate Howell Cobb's assertion that if slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong. For black South Carolinian men, the war provided an opportunity to demonstrate fitness for citizenship. Robert Smalls, a slave serving aboard a steamboat in Charleston Harbor, achieved a small military victory and an enormous propaganda triumph when he and his fellow slave crew members stole their vessel, their families, and themselves. With Smalls impersonating the vessel's white captain, they steamed past the harbor batteries and presented their prize to the Union Navy. For Smalls and many others, Union military service would pave the way for a career in politics. Nothing infuriated slaveholders more than the Union's enlistment of these black men. The Confederate response to these black Yankees, many of whom had been slaves only months or years before, sometimes resembled the brutal quashing of an insurrection conspiracy. The Confederate leadership often refused to treat captured black soldiers as prisoners of war and threatened to try all such soldiers and their white officers for the capital crime of fomenting insurrection. Black soldiers knew that falling into Confederate hands could mean being sent south as plunder, sold as slaves, or slaughtered. Some Confederates took particular satisfaction in killing black troops. If there was anything that we hated worse than another, it was a Negro soldier, declared a cavalry scout serving under Edgefield's Matthew Butler. On an icy Virginia road, 2 days before Christmas 1864, his men ambushed the black troops of a Union patrol. They took the white officers prisoner, but killed all black soldiers they could chase down. Other units massacred black Union soldiers under circumstances that did not even offer the fig leaf excuse of military necessity or the heat of battle. But some encounters with black soldiers were less satisfying for Confederates. In the opinion of a captured member of South Carolina's Edisto Rifles, the most humiliating part of prison life was the fact of being guarded by Negro soldiers. Surprised that these guards had displayed no savagery or even malice, he speculated that many of them had not yet lost that feeling of subserviency to their Southern masters. On the surface, paternalism was proven true. Former slaves, even after donning a blue uniform, instinctively treated white Southern men with respect. But the fear that this chastening subserviency would eventually be lost, revealed that beneath it all, the soldier assumed that black people could only be trusted to the extent that they remained cowed by slavery's violent discipline. From the beginning of the war, Ben Tillman had expressed a blustery Confederate patriotism. In a letter to his sister Anna, he wrote off reports of Confederate defeats as Yankee lies and denounced various Union officials, Pope and McClellan, as lying generals, Butler as an insulter of women, Buell and Johnson as Negro rogues, and Lincoln, Seward and Company as a set of expletive signs fools. A career of calumny was off to an auspicious start. He saw the war firsthand in 1863 when he traveled to Georgia to find his brother James, who had been wounded at the Battle of Chickamauga. The trip revealed that even in wartime, a young white man had a special place in this society. He had set out to find James with his mother, but at Atlanta she was sent back because no women were allowed to go any further toward the front. 16-year-old Ben, though, was allowed to proceed. He rode atop a boxcar to Marietta, sheltering himself from the rush of chilly air behind a slave accompanying one of the soldiers. In this way, he recalled, I became fairly comfortable. One of the man's mudsill might be another man's windbreak. He finally found James back in Atlanta by searching through makeshift hospitals and becoming thoroughly familiar with the death scenes and horrors of war. On the way back home, he encountered a line of Union prisoners on their way to the prison at Andersonville and felt a surge of hatred and intense feeling of animosity toward these invaders of our homes and destroyers of our liberty. I said to myself, rather than to anybody else, that they all ought to be shot. Tillman was learning the language of defiance. Tillman had to wait for a chance to shoot someone. He spent early 1864 back in school, as his mother and brothers hoped to give him enough of an education to allow him to enter South Carolina College once the war ended. George was grown, James was wounded, and the rest of the Tillman brothers were dead. In addition to the unlamented John, Ben's brother Henry had died of illness in 1859, and Oliver had been killed in Florida in 1860. Sophia Tillman would not live forever, and she could hardly surrender the household to her married daughter Anna or to either of Ben's older but unmarried sisters, Martha and Frances. It made sense to invest the family's resources in Ben, the only male who might realistically take charge of the household. In an 1864 essay on politeness, the youngest son was already clearly trying out the role of paternalist gentleman, imagining how he might acquire the social grace that rendered a superior amiable, an equal agreeable, and an inferior acceptable. He acknowledged that such an attainment required many years of study and a strict discipline of the mind. But there was no time for such study. By the summer of 1864, as the struggling Confederacy reached to the bottom of its pool of potential soldiers, Ben Tillman's two veteran brothers agreed that he should join a coastal artillery unit. The war was going badly enough for the Confederacy. Edgefield officers Martin Gary and Matthew Butler rose to the rank of general, but the typical soldier was not so fortunate. Of the 130 mostly Edgefield men who made up Company K of the 14th South Carolina Volunteers, half were killed or captured, and only 20 still bore arms at the Confederate surrender. These casualty rates represented the kind of catastrophe the war brought to local communities like Tillman's. The Confederacy's misfortunes demoralized many of its soldiers. Letters from home describing wartime deprivations as well as fears about the impending Union invasion of the state caused increasing numbers of enlisted men and officers to desert, Confederate nationalism proving less powerful than their desire to protect their own households. Decades later, even the sentimental memoirs of former Confederate officers would acknowledge that by early 1865, white Southern men of nearly every rank were disappearing from their posts. They had, after all, gone to war in defense of their rights as independent masters of their household arrangements. Now that those households were threatened by actual armies, the relative strengths of their loyalties should have come as no surprise. Elites, although terrified of losing their slave property, hesitated to coerce their poorer white neighbors into continued service. James Henry Hammond had done more than most planters for white people impoverished by the war, providing food at crucial times, but in the waning months of the war, he feared that his neighbors would set his property afire if he cooperated with efforts to impose a draft. Ben Tillman never made it into the increasingly battered and demoralized Confederate Army. On 10 July 1864, as Union troops forced Atlanta's defenders back to within a few miles of the city itself, a cranial tumor struck him down with fever and convulsions. An army surgeon removed the tumor, but the operation destroyed Tillman's left eye and left him gravely ill. For months, it remained unclear whether he would live or die. He remembered little from this period. To put him out of reach of Sherman's army while he convalesced, Sophia and George sent Ben and his sister Frances to live with relatives in Elberton, Georgia. Edgefield slaveholders' fervent military commitment expressed itself to the bitter end. Matthew Butler rode with his cavalry for nearly 2 years after suffering serious injury. At Appomattox, Martin Gary refused to surrender and rode south to join the Confederate cabinet in its flight from Richmond. But the Confederate armies no longer had sufficient men, supplies, or unity of purpose to maintain the struggle. Tillman found the Confederate surrender a sad and depressing state of affairs, but he was preoccupied with personal concerns not limited to the recovery of his health. In Elberton, he met the woman he would soon court and eventually wed, Sally Stark, daughter of a wealthy planter. He had never been a soldier and would never be a slaveholder, but he had yet to see what white manhood could offer him as a farmer and husband. Chapter 2. Planters and the Gentleman from Africa. As he reached 18 in the summer of 1865, Ben Tillman faced both adulthood and emancipation. Some challenges were private, like his feelings for Sally Stark, the planter's daughter, whom he had met during his convalescence in Georgia. Even in the diary he kept during the first post-war years, she appeared only as the anonymous object of his repeated inscription, "I love you, I adore you." Although he later remembered having fallen in love with her during the first summer they met, he would not make such a declaration to Sally herself until early 1867. Material necessity, not lack of ardor, helped explain the delay. Around the same time that he found his future wife, Tillman returned to South Carolina, where he, his mother, and the wounded James attempted to reassemble the broken pieces of the plantation household. Former slaveholders, in 1865, the future seemed painfully uncertain and the available options exasperating. Tillman reached independent manhood in a world where the meanings of those two crucial words no longer seemed self-evident. Between the aspirations of former slaves and those of former masters lay a gap too wide to be bridged. Emancipation and Reconstruction unleashed hopeful strivings among black and white Southerners, but these revolutions also fostered a backlash of devastating ferocity. For more than a decade, former slaves and former slaveholders, one group strong in numbers and long suppressed ambitions, the other rich in political experience, military capacity, landed wealth, and historic authority, would pursue their very different visions of Southern life and labor. Meanwhile, those Southerners who had been neither masters nor slaves struggled to define and defend their own interests. The struggle began as free people, and planters wrestled over the meaning of free labor, and it gained ferocity in the period after 1868 when the votes of former slaves elected a Republican state government. The black majority's drive for education and land ownership threatened to shrink the pool of workers available to men like Tillman, and those workers who remained demanded much higher wages for their labor.
As African Americans moved toward social, political, and economic independence, former slaveholders like Tillman struggled to sustain the antebellum world's hierarchies and habits. They did so in part through the electoral democracy, but more and more their campaign unfolded in the realms of collective action, physical intimidation, electoral fraud, and white terrorism. Both Republicans and their opponents deployed economic and physical sanctions against constituents who strayed into the opposing camp. Only the foes of Reconstruction, however, with their long experience of violent domination and military mobilization, proved willing to treat the other party as less than human and to make cold-blooded murder a campaign tactic. During the antebellum era, planters had understood that labor control was an essential aspect of agricultural reform, and even after slavery, they knew that political and economic authority remained linked. Their assault on black autonomy and democratic institutions would have to be as well planned and coordinated as a military campaign if it were to succeed. In the war over Reconstruction, men did battle, but so did images and ideas flowing from the very different histories of white and black Southern manhood. As Republican militias clashed with Democratic rifle clubs, each group claimed legitimacy. One man's mob was another man's militia. Republicans had allies in the federal government, but they labored against powerful currents of historic hopes and fears. Although Union victory and black citizenship had in theory destroyed and in practice at least undermined the white male monopoly on legitimate authority, no defeat could undo white men's expectations that Reconstruction would take time and patience, and former slaveholders and Confederate officers were determined to disrupt it. White Democrats mobilizing against the Republican government relied on the same strategy of promise and threat, accommodation and violence that they had employed to govern slaves. This time, they sought to distribute the burden of paternalist protection and violent threats across different parts of their anti-Republican coalition. They used the language of the mob to distance themselves from the very acts of violence they promoted, claiming that these assaults were carried out by disreputable white men, mobs, that is, from which only respectable white men could protect black Southerners. Black and white Republicans, for their part, faced the daunting task of persuading white men that armed black men could represent legitimate order and authority, not a slave insurrection, and that military companies led by former Confederate officers posed the real threat. They also had to contend with allies in the state and federal capitals who made the fatal error of taking the former slaveholders at their word. Amid the turmoil of this revolution and counter-revolution, Ben Tillman rose to the ranks of leadership. When the war was over. At least in terms of relative economic power, emancipation had hardly turned Ben Tillman's world upside down. As wartime visions of confiscation and redistribution faded, former slaves found they had few resources but their labor. Federal officials required them to sign annual labor contracts with former slaveholders men whose literacy and economic experience gave them the upper hand. These early contracts provided laborers with few rights and little more than a slave's subsistence. At the end of July 1865, James Tillman and his mother Sophia presented a contract to the freedmen for their signatures. After 2 days of deliberation, most signed, although a man named Tucker refused, and by the end of August, Edgefield's federal provost marshal apparently gave his approval. The contract's terms obligated the plantation's laborers to work through the end of the year for the miserly wage of 1/10 of the corn and potatoes and 1/12 of the peas they produced. Free labor, it seemed, might mean labor that went virtually unremunerated. But freed people were not slaves, and, at least in theory, they could not be physically forced to labor. Throughout the South, former slaves moved from field to road to town without passes, reconstructing their families, seeking subsistence, and exploring the meaning of freedom. The bounds of the Southern household, once the physical perimeter of a white patriarch's authority, could be crossed and recrossed at the will by persons no longer held to labor. At least 4 male workers left the Tillman's fields during a brief period in June. 10 days later, James Tillman sent Amy and child off, probably an act of retaliation against the family of one of those absent men. In early July, 4 freedmen, in his diary, Tillman surrounded the word with skeptical quotation marks, went to Augusta without his permission. One of them was Tucker, the former slave, initially reluctant to settle the offered contract, who apparently came and went as he pleased during early August. As planners like the Tillmans struggled to salvage the 1865 season, they seemed not to acknowledge that they had lost legal control of black people's bodies. By November 1865, a fully recovered Ben Tillman noted without further comment, "Mike worked half of today, gave him a whipping." From the Tillman brothers' perspective, the sources of former slaves' recalcitrance was easy to discern. Part of the explanation for their misbehavior was, of course, racial. It was hardly surprising to former slaveholders that black laborers, freed from a master's benevolent coercion, proved fundamentally indolent and unreliable. As under slavery, these natural tendencies were worsened by corrupting influences. In early August, a company of black soldiers from the U.S. colored troops briefly camped on the Tillman plantation near the overseer's house and rambled all over the place, some of them very bold and impudent. A combination of their color, their uniform, their behavior, and their proximity encouraged one freedman, Henry, to look to them for protection. After Jim Tillman thrashed him for having left the plantation without permission, Henry ran off again, this time to the village of Edgefield, seeking aid from the provost marshal. Men accustomed to mastery did not easily surrender their expectations of supreme authority over their laborers. Although Henry returned from Edgefield having spoken with the federal provost marshal, Tillman whipped him again. But violence was a means of achieving authority more than an end in itself. When another freedman, Thomas, became involved in a dispute with a Yankee soldier, James Tillman interposed himself between the two men to prevent the soldier from beating the laborer. Authority had to flow in only one direction, but just as important, it also had to flow from only one source. For many planters, this insistence on unrestricted patriarchal authority challenged even the most basic recognition of family ties amongst the former slaves. That fall, white Edgefield landowner Thomas Price beat a black female employee. When the woman's father refused to assist Price by holding his daughter down, Price beat him as well, breaking the man's arm. Such actions reflected the planters' continued expectation of a patriarchal authority over black people that transcended those people's ties of family and affection. It also served as a grim reminder of their continued readiness to resort to violence. As the difficult year came to a close, it became apparent that the former slaveholders did not accept legitimacy of emancipation. South Carolina's 1865 Constitutional Convention officially accepted the end of slavery, but Edgefield native and secession Governor F.W. Pickens warned the new provisional governor not to underestimate the influence of men taking the ground that slavery was not and could not be abolished and swearing they would never submit to it. Just as the Tillmans put skeptical quotation marks around the word freedmen, planters throughout the South worked to limit the day-to-day meaning of black freedom. The new legislatures chosen by the old electorate in late 1865 codified this reactionary vision of emancipation. South Carolina's Black Codes, passed in September, placed severe restrictions on black movement, employment, and association, denying black people the right to own land or change employers, and providing for punitive whippings and the involuntary apprenticeship of black children. Further, planter legislatures sought to ensure their collective security against any resistance to this new, old state of affairs. Black laborers' expanded legal autonomy, many planters believed, required expanding monitoring and discipline. No simple patrol system would do, and just as James Henry Hammond had predicted 2 decades before, white men responded to the end of slavery by organizing armed police. "We must have mounted infantry," asserted one planter, "to enforce whatever regulations we can make." Although for the moment the only infantry in place belonged to the U.S. Army, the 1865 legislature did in fact call for dozens of new state militia units. Cooler heads, those who understood the reaction the codes would generate among Northern Republicans, soon prevailed, softening some of the limits on black land ownership and other important matters, but moderation only went so far. The legislators almost unanimously rejected the 14th Amendment. Former slaves as well as former masters could organize themselves to defend their interests. In addition to founding churches and schools, they formed neighborhood associations, political clubs, and other groups to improve their local bargaining power. Some might assemble in reaction to landowners' initiatives, as the Tillmans, former slaves, no doubt did in the late summer of 1865. But freed people's organizations were much more than discussion groups. Some former slaves banded together in paramilitary units, marching, drilling, and even taking on military titles. They served as self-defense forces for black communities, sometimes seizing white terrorists and handing them over to U.S. authorities. As historian Julie Saville observes, these groups constituted a working-class black male claim to participate in public life, stepping free of antebellum distinctions of race and status and asserting a revolutionary new relationship between black Southerners and the state. Black men's assumption of the responsibilities of citizenship, from the establishment of individual patriarchal households to collective political and martial action, played havoc with white men's expectations. In the eyes of many white men, black men were inherently unfit for citizenship. They could not constitute a legitimate body of the people, and they had no place in public meetings, public rallies, or military service. When black men did take on these roles, they were depicted sometimes as comical and ignorant, but more often as impudent and riotous as a mob. For some black men's mobilizations represented a slave revolt that could not be put down by force of law, interpreting black self-mobilization as evidence that emancipation would cascade out of control into a Haitian-style revolution. Planters feared the worst. As the first Christmas of emancipation approached at the end of 1865, many former slaveholders believed the year would end in the outright revolt that anti-abolitionists had long predicted. James Tillman nervously turned loose his Negroes, then watched them rambling all over the country and running to town. On 30th of December, he tersely reported, "Matters in status quo." No revolt came. Instead, early January brought a less dramatic but nonetheless unsettling event, as a dozen or more former slaves left the Tillmans forever to be replaced by hired Negroes and freedmen previously unknown to Sophia, James, and Ben. Florida. James died of his wounds in 1866, and at the end of that year, Sophia and Ben hit upon a new strategy to recoup the family's fortunes. Following his late brother Oliver's less than successful lead, Tillman departed in December for the cotton lands of Marion County in north central Florida. There he bought land worth $3,500, putting up $100 in earnest money and promising to pay most of the rest by February. After making a brief trip to Edgefield, he returned to Florida with his sister, Frances, and several persons of color, all of Edgefield District, South Carolina. It was a decision made by thousands of Georgia and South Carolina planters, and every day brought a new wave of settlers through the junctions of Tallahassee and Jacksonville. As they rebuilt the world of cotton on rich new soil, they recreated the demographics of their former home counties. By 1867, Marion and 7 other Florida counties had black majorities. As in other land rushes, the inexperienced could become victims, and George Tillman worried that his younger brother had chosen his acres poorly, and even that he might have obtained a bad title. "Benny, you are as a lamb among wolves in venturing as you have done about all this land business in Florida," the grown man lectured the innocent boy. But although it might have been far better to have kept the money in view of the awful times just ahead of us, the deed was done, and George promised to never more say anything about it. Ben must learn by experience, like myself and all our various brothers. This might not have been as reassuring to Ben as George intended it to be, but it was independence. The black men and women who worked for Ben Tillman in Florida in 1867 knew what he expected of them. The contract they signed early that year required them to obey the young white man's orders without discussion or dissent. To show respect for Tillman, his family, and his guests, and to labor from sunup to sundown, or longer when the harvest required, the Florida contract's provisions suggested that the coercion of free labor might provide former slaveholders with comforting continuities. A worker who left the fields without permission for even a few days could forfeit the entire season's wage. But the appearance of continuity was deceptive. Although Tillman still owned the land and black men and women still labored on it, the terms and texture of those roles had changed forever. The persons of color Tillman employed had been free for most of 2 years, and they no longer accepted the miserly terms offered them in 1865. Tillman's Florida laborers earned a full third of nearly everything they produced, an almost fourfold increase in their wages. Furthermore, landowners' coercive authority no longer rested on the laws of slavery and white patriarchal sovereignty, but on legal agreement subject to review by federal authorities. Masters had long complained of the shortcomings of Cuffy and Sambo, antebellum archetypes assumed to be childishly mercurial and malleable. Now, however, free people's rising expectations produced a new, more defiant figure. Tillman found himself facing the gentleman from Africa, whose grotesque pretensions to manhood and citizenship, supported by a conquering army, thwarted the efforts of landed white and therefore real gentlemen. I belong to that class of les miserables, Tillman complained to his fiancée during the summer of 1867, who are trying to distill greenbacks out of their Mother Earth by the free labor process. In Florida, Tillman suggested black workers had become even more demoralized by emancipation than they were in Georgia and South Carolina. Consequently, he delicately explained to Sally, what is necessary there is most especially requisite in Florida. Planters did not stop beating disobedient laborers simply because it was no longer legal. Mastery did not submit so easily. Commanding free labor in Florida was a grueling, unrewarding experience, but it did allow Tillman to see himself as a household head, not just a master, but a potential husband and father as well. By late March 1867, he had found the words to propose marriage to Sally Stark. Unable either to leave his fields or to endure the suspense of waiting until he could see her, he wrote to tell her, "I love you." He had feared to speak, he explained, first because he had not known whether he would recover from his illness, and then because of the convulsions of the early post-war period. He also acknowledged that he was imperfect. Those who knew him well, he told her, called him passionate, morose, rude, unsocial, obstinate, impulsive, proud, sometimes selfish, which only I utterly deny, and I know that my countenance, originally not worth sunburning, is marred by the traces of disease. Per contra, he repeated in conclusion, I love the truth and I love you. The letter took weeks to reach Sally, and she took 2 more weeks to reply, so her acceptance did not reach Tillman in Florida until the second half of May. Delighted, he immediately began playfully chiding her about having taken so long to write, as he would do during periods of separation over 54 years of marriage. Sally became his sweetheart, his somebody. He called her, and soon his wife. In letters throughout the second half of 1867, he laid out the family's situation, including the necessity of his remaining in Florida, perhaps as part of negotiations over a wedding date. He asked whether she would return with him to Florida. He did not present a comforting picture of frontier life. In addition to the problem of managing free labor, with which the planter's daughter would have been intimately familiar, Tillman faced a difficult climate. The plantation he had at first grandiloquently dubbed Kenilworth had soon mockingly renamed Rainy Shanty or Mosquito Hall. Still, Sally assented. Tillman returned north for a series of brief visits early that winter, and the couple married on the 8th of January 1868 before returning to Florida for the planting season. Context of White Supremacy. I was a little bit confused. I was looking at the book and I was like, is that right? Is that where it ended at? But yes, that is where that is where we stopped at. So we will be picking up, if you are following along, page 47. The Republicans come to power. That is, it's a bold subheading. The Republicans come to power, bottom of page 47 in my text, Context of White Supremacy. Before I get to the callers and everything, I just want to make sure I get on the record that at least here, it is a lovely day. It is right at 90 degrees, sunny, hot, great day to be at the pool, out frolicking, having a grand old time, having a barbecue or whatever you do when the weather is great. Go to the beach and all that good stuff. Anything but reading about 19th century racists. That is what we're hanging out doing. Hanging out to read about 19th century racists. Anywho, Context of White Supremacy. Justice, Gus T Renegade, in for another broadcast. If you would like to call in to participate, the number to dial is 760-569-7676. The code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. The number again, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Alrighty, if you would like to use the free flash phone, it should be linked at Black Talk Radio Network. If you need the address, it is tinytiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. That address again, tinytiny.cc/1race, and that is the number 1. When you put in that address, click the link on the left side of the page. It says free flash phone. Click it. It will open a small window on your screen. The top line, it is a drop-down menu that has the same number that I just gave out, which again is 760-569-7676. And the code is 564943 pound. The number 760-569-7676. The next line, it will ask for the code. It is 564943. You do not need to put pound in, just put the number. The code again, 564943. And then the final line, it will ask for the name. You can put in your real name, nickname, whatever the case may be. Just once you get it all entered, click the green button at the bottom that says call the program. You should be able to hear us live. It is the same procedure. If you would like to participate, you should see the dial pad on the screen. Press star 6. When you do so, you should hear the audio prompt to press 1. Once you do that, I'll see your hand, we'll get you on the line, and we'll be good to go. Everybody who dialed in who has a hand up, your line should be open. Feel free to chime in. Oh, and make sure I get in as well. My apologies. There was a problem. Some of the people that were listening online were not able to hear at the beginning of the program. For some reason, the audio was not working, but that was taken care of. Don't know why it was not playing, but it was taken care of midway through. So if you called in to participate, you can feel free to listen online. It should be working. Everybody who dialed in with a hand up, you should be with us.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Greetings, Gus. Greetings to the other callers and listeners. The first thing that struck me about the reading is all of the terroristic acts, the violence, the perpetration of murders, all types of racist and terrorist acts. And then the history books seem to cover all this up. If this book had not been written with the type of painstaking research that the author did, a lot of this stuff would not probably even been known. I felt that it was getting to be quite strange that in this time during Reconstruction that no notable blacks had been mentioned, but then lo and behold, he mentioned Robert Smalls, the black man that commandeered a Confederate ship and turned it over to the Union. But there were other, notable people, Benjamin Franklin Randolph, who was murdered by a white terrorist in an ambush in 1876. Richard Kane, who helped draft the Progressive State Constitution, and a U.S. State Senator, Simon Coper, that was murdered and shot while he was praying, and I believe Benjamin Tillman was there as an accessory to that. And like I say, these terrorist acts entered into history books, painting Tillman as a heroic term, as a reformer and a person who led an egregious revolt to take the government back from the wealthy. And in reality, he was just racist, terrorist, and a murderer. They never failed to mention the failed attempt by Denmark Vesey. But I don't believe I'd ever heard of the Hamburg Massacre, where 7 black men were murdered. And I thought it was interesting that when South Carolina decided to secede from the Union, that President James Buchanan didn't do anything, while secession was an illegal act of treason. And, upon further research, you find that there were rumors that Buchanan was probably the first gay president. Proof of it was a May 13, 1844 letter that he wrote to Mrs. Roosevelt about his male roommate. But nepotism was running high in South Carolina politics. General Wade Hampton III was a grandson of U.S. Senator and later governor, and the brother-in-law to James Hammer. They also mentioned the Massachusetts 54th Regiment, where black men had served for the Union, and black men wanted to prove their manhood and to gain their freedom and citizenship by joining the military. And then even upon joining the military, they were more than likely, we know that they were paid less, and if they were captured by the Confederates, more likely to be killed, not taken or treated as prisoners of war. But even the North discriminated against the black soldiers, paying them less and not providing them equipment, for them to do their job. These senators and governors, were scoundrels. They had been known for incest. One guy raped his teenage nieces, 4 of them. That was Wade Hampton. And there were allegations, that he was taking African women, as his concubines or mistresses. They talked about white male solidarity. I guess talking about the tight bond that supposedly between white males that enable them to create and maintain this system of white supremacy. You know, it just goes to show that it's in effect when even today white managers are backed up white male workers, and that the results of all that is hindered non-white, black, and many females in the power structure of big business. I'll mute my line. Give someone else a chance. Thanks, Gus.
Appreciate that. All the other folks that had a hand up should be with us. I just want to make sure, because I know last week we had a lot of tangents, like we could stay focused on the book and not opportunities to talk about things that are distantly related to the text that we're on. Thank you kindly. Everybody else who has a hand up should be with us. Not sure what the issue is, but their line should be open. The other folks who dialed in. Yes, sir.
Hey, good evening. I'm Smith. Sorry, Gus, that you pulled you away from your summer 90 degrees. I know it doesn't get that warm up there often. To read this book, to thank you for doing it. However, I'm trying to picture all of this. Seems like there's a lot of white on white fighting, and but it seems like the one thing that they agree on is the contention they have with the Negroes, especially now that they're free and they have the skills and they're able to do the labor, but they're trying to figure out a way not to make them do the labor still for free. That's what I'm getting from it. And even going as far as to go to Florida. And I guess maybe they don't have the laws yet so they're trying now to get Florida to also, have both free labor. What I'm getting is black people got into a lot of bad contracts after slavery, and those contracts binded them to performing labor duties at a very low rate, and I can only put it in context of today, and it seems like, they pretty much mastered that now, not paying blacks the same as they would, for normal labor. This is just an unwritten rule, and I think the way that things work in the workplace today. I find the book to be very interesting. I think that at one point, did he say that he was reading books from Walter Scott? So it's kind of like, wow, that's the guy that got Scott. Same name, and that's about it. Thank you very much, Gus.
Right on. Good catch on the Walter Scott. I thought that too. Other folks who have a hand up, feel free to chime in. I'm not sure. There are other folks who have a hand up. I don't know if they're in a spot where maybe they're not able to speak presently, or what the deal might be. Anyway, I'll give a few thoughts while we see they're going to join in with us or not. Let's see.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's Karma. Hi.
Greetings.
Okay, you just unmuted me. Thank you.
Oh, we can hear both of you.
Oh, okay. I can wait. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm very sure. Thank you. If I was just started studying the system of racial and white supremacy, it would be astonishing on how white people are so willing to work and organize to maintain the ability to mistreat people that they identify as being non-white, and that's what's in my mind. I'm doing something else while I'm listening, but that's what comes to my mind. by reading this book so far is the willingness to be at their grind, at their racist grind, and and we're talking about 150 years ago, so it's something that we need to understand and work up to. I'm talking about the non-white victims in general, not necessarily anybody who's listening on the line, but non-white victims in general. There's a lot of work to be done. A lot of work to be done as opposed to some of the things that we find ourselves doing with the idea in mind of saying, well, I don't have anything else to do, including studying the system of racist white supremacy, as opposed to what I think may be going on right now on the third and the fourth of somebody's life. Thank you.
It's Carmen again. Just to continue on with what the previous caller was saying, the mistreatment. I remember Mr. Fuller saying, so what is it about me missing a tooth that makes you think that is your permission to mistreat me? Or even if I don't have any teeth in my head at all, I'm completely toothless. That is just automatic permission to mistreat someone. And so they said, well, they couldn't read, and so they had all of these bad contracts, and of course they were mistreated. I failed to see the logic. I failed to see the logic in that, well, they can't read, so of course we'll have to be mistreating them. That gives us permission. It's okay to mistreat people. I think we need to challenge that. I challenge that every day when I run into corporate America. So this is the permission to mistreat me, right? So, but they do that. We fall for it every single time. We were falling for it then, like that's logical. And we're falling for it now. That is not logical. A bad contract, a duplicitous contract is not permission to mistreat someone, and you should challenge it. And I also, in corporate America, I was reading about it, and they said, oh, yeah, 90% of an employee's value is repurposed and retitled profit, and 10% of an employee's value is repurposed and retitled wages. I could not get over your average employee in corporate America these days makes.
We're going on tangent, kind of.
No, we weren't. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I forgot to connect it. He said that the slave back then, not the slave, the sharecropper got 1/10 of the corn profits that he raised, and he got 1/12 of the, what was it? Oh, I forget. Was it a fruit profit? But 1/10 of the corn and potato profit. And I'm just saying, nothing's changed. You just, you get, nothing's changed. You still only get 1/10. All right, so. And the last thing, I'm sorry, and when I do that, I fail to make the connection so that it can sound logical. I'm so sorry I do that. The other thing I thought, it sounded a lot like Sun Tzu when it said Mr. Tillman at a young age realized that for white men, I guess he was superior to, he would have to learn how to be amiable. And for those white men that he was equal to, he would have to learn how to be agreeable. And for those white men that he was, I don't know, I forget what the last one was, but it sounds like Sun Tzu, doesn't it? It sounds like The Art of War, but I don't remember reading that in The Art of War, but I thought it was really fascinating. And the last thing, I just thought it was too cold when he was talking about using the black person as a windbreaker. I mean, that's just, they're always cruel, but I mean just cruel in creative ways. So, that's it. My comments.
I think Joy, she should be with us as well. Howdy, feel free.
Hello everyone. I am really seeing a lot of parallels. Almost this book explains their behavior. This is how they've always behaved, and this is that sense of entitlement. They're entitled to mistreat us in any way that they feel like. And but one thing it does when after slavery, we kind of worked to reunite our families, and I think that gave us a strength. We have a strength that we don't even realize. How could any people survive the horrors of slavery? It doesn't even sound possible, but we know it happened. And so I think, in a way, it gives me a sense of pride to say these are the people that I come from, But then again, it makes me angry too, and want to fight a bit harder to finally get us the freedom that our ancestors died for. And the other thought I had listening was the police. The role of police then is the same as the role of the police now, to control us. And that's why you treat their people kindly, gently, and use as much brute force as they can against our people. And I will mute my line. Thank you.
Right on. Appreciate the observations from everyone. Definitely the police. I thought that was astronomical. It reminded me so much of Robert F. Wintersmith, his book Police in the Black Community, where he talks about the foundation of policing in the United States is slavery, enslavement of black people, and needing lots of white men to patrol and catch and chase down enslaved black people. But yeah, that really important point in the text. Some of the other things that stood out, pulling my notes up here. I was reminded, I have a history degree. I enjoy reading this type of stuff. This is great, but I feel like you get to learn a lot. I feel like, and again, we still are very early in this book. I know I think Mr. Demery mentioned the Hamburg massacre, that is not often referenced. That is in this book, and it's in detail in this book. We just haven't got to it yet. We have not, I don't even think we've read 10% of the book. Oh yeah, we've done 10. Okay, we've done 10%, but we're still very, very, very early in the book. We really haven't even gotten to the stuff, the reasons why he has these statues that they are not taking down and all the other stuff. So yeah, it's a lot, much, much more to come. But yeah, the history aspect, it started with the caning of Charles Sumner and John Brown. Of course, John Brown, gotta have John Brown moment. Those are signature moments. If you take a college class on Civil War or 19th century U.S. history, those, guaranteed those incidents are going to pop up, and they'll talk about the meaning and significance of that. But yes, white people will mistreat other white people, absolutely, particularly if they have disagreements about the practice of racism. This is from last week. It was the very beginning of the text where he talked about the racial instinct. Matter of fact, let me flip back so that I can get the exact passage. So this is on page 8 where he says, it also shows how Tillman shaped the national understanding of the meaning of racial violence. Although Tillman frequently boasted that the red shirt campaign of force and fraud had been a concerted effort, he argued that the roots of racial conflict lay not in politics or economics, but in racial instinct. When two races lived side by side, one or the other would have to rule, and by the 20th century, Tillman could point to electoral violence, labor struggles, and widespread lynching as evidence that white men had prevailed. But just this idea that there is almost sounding like an ingrained inclination towards Dylann Roof type terrorism is the way I'm interpreting this. I'm just there's a white tendency to project their pathologies onto non-white people so that they can overgeneralize and say that everybody behaves like this and has this instinct towards racial violence. But that, in my opinion, is just not true. There's no evidence to support that. There's one group that is the white race that this fits the bill. But just folks have comments on that as we go through the book. Feel free to shout those out as well. Let's see, the article. Oh my goodness, there's some articles. I was just doing research on Tillman because there's more, like his statue was vandalized this week. Doing research. We're so early in the book, I was going to read some of the stuff, but I think some of that is in here, but we just haven't got to it yet. So I have to kind of keep that stuff on the side and see if they leave out things in the book, then I will add as we go. On page 32, like my jaw dropped when I read this the first time when they we're talking about this fear of black people that they had. It says, this is after John Brown's execution. Amid widespread fears of militant abolitionist retaliation, the editor felt compelled to dispel rumors that the governor of Virginia had asked South Carolina to furnish substantial aid to her northern frontier. The danger, however, might be much closer at hand. Any space not fully under the surveillance and control of the planter class could present a threat. The instance, the local market center of Augusta and its concentration of people outside the slaveholders' immediate orbit. James Henry Hammond warned his fellow agricultural reformers at a December 1959 meeting that there are now more abolitionists in Augusta than took Harper's Ferry. If an insurrection should break out, about here in Augusta would be the place. The Negro churches of cities presented the greatest danger, for they could easily be converted from religious into military organizations. Particularly with what's going on right now, reminded me of that. I don't claim to see any evidence that black churches are becoming military organizations, but nonetheless, the attacks are happening. On page 43, I was going to ask, because this book, Stephen Kantrowitz, this is a white author, if there have been moments that stand out as, I think Mr. Kantrowitz might be practicing racism in the way he presented or talked about. I think Karma, you were referencing the point where they were saying that the black people were being taken advantage of in these contract situations because the white planters, they had more experience, more education. I could be incorrect. I'll get the passage again. I'll try to get that passage that you were referencing as well about the different way to conduct yourself depending on the power of the person that you're talking to. But I'll try to get the passage. But my interpretation of it was that he was just stating the fact, like, this is going to happen, not an endorsement or that it's right or something like that, but just this is going to happen. Like, they are going to be exploited. That's what's going to happen. Not necessarily an endorsement, but I'll make sure I go back and get that passage I can share. If folks had any comments or thoughts on the white author, anything that stood out as perhaps the white author practicing racism, or Ben Tillman's suggestion that white people have some sort of inclination to violent racial behavior.
I have one more thing I want to add, because it's something you said, Gus. You said about the churches, and I've been listening off and on. The churches have always been the number one recipients of the terrorist attacks and threats in the United States. The FBI knows that. They say, where do most terror attacks, where are they directed? The black church, specifically the black church. I mean, they do a list every year. It's always has been. The black church is the number one recipient of terroristic threats and attacks every year, without fail. And I don't think anyone's mentioned that.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I could be wrong about this, so I'm just trying to get someone else's ideas and thoughts on it. This is something that has something to do with what you asked. The black the quote-unquote black church at that particular point in time, were they also, other than what churches do, preparing themselves also to defend themselves and or to not only just from a standpoint of self-defense, but also preparing to be offensive against their slave masters during that time. I mean, I've heard of Nat Turner. I would assume Denmark Vesey was doing something very similar. Would it be safe to say that that's what probably a lot of them were doing, and in turn that may have had white people somewhat, I don't want to say the word nervous, but aware of it. Would that sound correct?
The text seems to suggest that, that the white people had, that was their fear, that, that's what they were going to do, or that's what they easily could end up doing.
Right. It makes sense. I mean, it makes sense because, you turn your back. In other words, I'm thinking along the terms of white people as I know I'm mistreating these people, and I'm sure they're aware that I'm mistreating them. Now I leave them alone, and in turn they are by nature are organizing. They may be reading my text, somewhere in there, but they're also doing some other things because I mean some of the songs were actually codes. That's a fact. I know there were codes when they were in those fields, and in turn, I'm pretty sure they were singing those songs out there in the woods and whatnot when they were together. And I don't know. I mean, I just think that the race and white supremacists had a lot less good sleeping nights back 150 years ago than what they do now. They sleep good now. As opposed to back 100 years ago. That's just my thoughts based on logic, based on what was going on back then and what's happening now. In a different version of mistreatment. The system of racist white supremacy now is more deceiving, more refined now than it was back during that time.
What do you? Oh, I was just going to add real quick, but Mr. Demer, I was just going to add real quick because they did bring up now that slavehold. This is on page 35. Slaveholders in the infant Confederacy anxiously insisted that slaves would validate their paternalist pretensions under the heading "The Faithful Negro." The Edgefield Advertiser declared that the South has no better friend in her troubles than the everlasting nigger. Which suggests that they are sleeping pretty good. Even though he does say that it does seem like they have a lot of anxieties, like that they might have been lying, and even that they knew that they were lying and were having a tough time even trying to convince themselves of saying that, because he was saying that black people were stealing stuff and doing what they could to subvert terrorism. So.
Okay.
I shouldn't say stealing. That's just confiscating. I mean, really, you're just compensating for being in a terrible position. That's not stealing in correct terms. Mr. Demery, feel free.
Yes, I just wanted to mention that these Tillman, even after the Civil War, the signing of the Emancipation, refused to abide by the rules, and the state Congress, refused to recognize any of the federal laws that have been put into effect. And that's all that I want to comment on.
One thing I would definitely add I think I've been very clear in my stance on the Confederate flag and Ben Tillman stat. Leave it all up. Just, let's just be clear about who these people are, what this represents. For that flag, I would make sure to remind, or just to bring up to have fun, to get a response, like the incident where they talk about how the Confederate soldiers, and I think Thomas Smith brought this up before, but would go out of their way to hunt down and slaughter black people. Mr. Demery Ford, brought this up, but would go down to hunt them and slaughter them, and talks about this was the greatest indignity for a white Confederate soldier to be guarded by a black soldier. And there's so many documented incidents of this. Fort Pillow was one where they just went and massacred black Union soldiers. This is like 1864, 1865. It's tons of incidents of this. I would reference passage, or even you could just take that passage on page 37 of this text where he talks about how they hated a nigger Union soldier, and some of these times where they just went out and slaughtered black people, and ask if that is a part of the Southern heritage that we are supposed to be recognizing at the state capitol and wherever else they have this at. Folks have any other comments? Nothing stood out. White author practicing racism. Definitely keep an eye out for that as we proceed through the text. If anything, wording or description of something. I thought on page 43 where he says, he's talking about how this terrorist was beating this black female, enslaved black female, or I guess allegedly, quote unquote, slavery has ended, allegedly, but this guy, Thomas Price, this terrorist, is beating this black female, and the father, he's asking this black female's father to come help him beat her, and the black father has some self-respect and refuses to do that, so then he beats up the black father and breaks his arm, and he says such actions reflected the planner's continued expectations of a patriarchal authority over black people that transcended those people's ties of family and affection. Just that I've heard that those people, that phrase in reference to black people, I've heard that. You people, those people, I've heard that phrase before. Perhaps that was just, grammatically that's the way that it's supposed to be there, but I have heard that before. I also thought the descriptions, and this is a biography, so he's giving the full, we're getting the complete picture, right? But I thought that was very humanizing. This is a terrorist, but we're getting like his love letters to his wife and his, I guess, when he was too shy to even speak to her and he just put his journal. We're getting a very human picture of this guy and his frailties when he's sick and trying to recuperate and all that. I feel like that is a contrast, at least thus far, to the typical way that black people are talked about in the system of white supremacy, where they're not presented with that sort of humanity most of the time, frequently. See, make sure nothing else stood out. Yeah, we haven't really even got to the juicy part yet. I'm looking forward to once we get to some of that. If nobody has anything else, we will go ahead and get to the second audio segment. Nothing else from folks listening in?
Observed?
Yes, sir.
Hey, Gus. I had a few observations. Actually, the same ones you made, but I kind of tied this book into a book that we had earlier this year, Walter Williams. And when I think it began, and his grandfather, who had some literacy, he knew he was being cheated, and he went to the white man, and pretty much the white man told him, go screw yourself. I'm not paying you. and they had to sneak off the plantation, and that was probably 30, 40 years after this book, at this time frame. So this has been going on for years, and I think that the author, he could have alluded, like he just made it seem like it was nothing, but, this is a continuing thing, and that was in Louisiana, I believe, and I'll meet my line.
Yep, that was Robert Williams, the Venus and Serena's. Richard, sorry, thank you, Richard Williams. That he talked about I think that was his grandparents who had to sneak off the plantation in Louisiana. And I mean, this was 1900, so I mean, this was not quote unquote slavery, allegedly, but they had to sneak off the plantation to escape. Yeah, I thought that was important as well. Important observation as well. A lot of this sounds very similar. The black codes that they listed and all of that. I mean, that's what I mean. Like, white people are very good. They can go and take down. Okay, we'll take down the black codes. Okay, we'll take down the Confederate sign. And then it's just the same thing. It's still the same old plantation that is in operation. They're very good at doing that sort of thing. I still am struggling to get those two quotes. If I don't get them before we get the second audio, I'll have them before the program concludes. I don't know why I'm having a difficult time finding it. Anything else? Are folks satisfied? Anything else before we get to the second audio? The armed black troops. Nobody had anything. I thought that was great.
I had something to say about that too. I didn't mention it because you guys kind of touched on it with the church when you said that he was afraid that the church. But yeah, black people were arming themselves. I kind of wrote a little note here saying, man, that's what call that black self-respect. Arming themselves, and I guess they had to. I mean, look at the alternative back then. I mean, you had to arm yourself if you had any bit of land. But they went around that and took away the blacks' right to own land, period. So, I mean, it's just the works, I mean, the blacks seem to be doing pretty good for themselves at a point after slavery, doing much better than some whites, even, and they took away that right for them to do that. Can't own no land, sorry. Come work for us for 1/10 of a percentage of your crop. I mean, they're just geniuses at it, man. They have no heart when it comes down to practicing racism, and a lot of it is directly result of taking away our opportunities to do good for ourselves. They want it all. That's all I have to add.
Yeah, that's what I mean. That's been my experience when people ask, reading and why is reading important and all of that, because there are a lot of things that you will never see on television. And I don't think you're going to see too many programs that give a serious portrayal, not something stupid and cartoonish like Django or Shaft, but I mean a serious portrayal of serious black people, entire black families, entire black towns exhibiting black self-respect and having orchestrated, organized, armed self-defense. You are not going to see that portrayed very often on television. There are a lot of books that detail, because there have been tons of black people who did that. That's why I say it should be so just immediately opposed anyone suggesting that black people are cowards or chumps or lames or whatever the case may be, and we haven't fought back. That is absolutely no, you're going to be in a loud area. If you could just make sure you mute your line, that would be great. But yeah, we have a long record of black people around the world who have violently resisted racism, white supremacy, even from the black church. Yeah, that was it. I think that might be it, unless I think everybody else is good. I didn't hear anybody else with anything else they wanted to get in, it seemed like. I guess I would just toss in that folks, while doing all of this, keep in mind, and we really haven't even got to the juicy Tillman parts yet, keep in mind He has a statue on not just at the South Carolina State Capitol, but also on the campus of Clemson University, as well as Winthrop University in South Carolina. They have been working to try to take all of those statues down this year prior to Dylan Storm Roof's actions. And they failed. All of the efforts failed. White people said they absolutely were not going to take his statue down. And if I have the tab here, I guess I'll read this and then we can go ahead and get to the second audio clip. Is this it? Yes, I do. Okay, so this white person, he wrote the Edgefield Advertiser. This is the town where Ben Tillman is from. They have an online publication that you can check out, and obviously they have been talking about the situation in Charleston and Ben Tillman and the monuments that they have to this guy in their town. So this white man, Robert Scott, wrote an article. It's titled Clemson University, Winthrop University, and Tillman Hall. And coincidentally, the building on both campuses is named Tillman Hall. So I'm not going to read the article. I'm just scrolling down to the comments. So this white, I think it's a white woman. Her name is Annie. She writes, "You failed to mention that there would not be a Clemson or a Winthrop had it not been for Ben Tillman. Your editorial simply fans flames that need to be put out. I spent 4 years in that building that you want to rename, becoming a teacher. The action you advocate would strip the rights of those thousands who hold dear the memory of graduating from Clemson and attending classes in Tillman Hall. Are our rights not important as well? I am sick and tired of others trying to create news for those who scream injustice. I teach history, South Carolina history. Maybe we should burn the state." This is from Annie, March 20th of this year, well before the roof shooting. With that, we'll get to the second audio segment. If there are other folks, if you had questions, comments, and you didn't get a chance to share, just make a little note, and we will have time after this audio segment concludes. Context of White Supremacy will be picking up on page 47. Folks have the actual book. Bottom of 47, The Republicans Come to Power. Context of White Supremacy. The Republicans come to power. That year, however, proved to be one of defeat for both Tillman and his class. Farming in Florida grew less and less profitable, culminating in an infestation of caterpillars that wiped out a promising crop. But even before Ben, Sally, and Francis packed up the household and returned to South Carolina, larger developments rocked the postbellum South. In Washington, D.C., congressional Republicans, enraged by former slaveholders' intransigence and Andrew Johnson's leniency, sought the president's impeachment and took command of Reconstruction. Under the Reconstruction Acts, the new state governments were swept aside and the military took charge of a new voter registration, one that included black men. Confederate General Wade Hampton and a few other wealthy white men tried to hold back the tide, urging former slaves to choose their old masters as their new political leadership, but the elections of 1868 swept them from positions of authority. Aside from the fact that the old and new leadership classes were composed entirely of men, they had little in common. As freedmen suddenly became a voting majority and began to participate in state politics, a new political coalition of Southerners and Northerners, black and white, slave and freeborn, sought to direct their political energy. Freeborn, literate black men like Robert B. Elliott and Benjamin F. Randolph arrived from outside the state to join the Republican Party leadership, and former South Carolina slaves rose to prominence as well, including Union veterans like Lawrence Kane, Prince Rivers, and the intrepid Robert Smalls. Most post-bellum black leaders stood unapologetically for manhood suffrage and argued that neither race nor class nor education should limit this right. Political judgments, they asserted, were matters of common sense and self-education, investigating and discovering who are his friends and voting for them, and also who are his enemies and refusing to vote for them
is a learning easily acquired, declared Randolph in 1867. Many homegrown military companies and neighborhood associations became political clubs of Union League or Republican Party, and through them, black voters mobilized to register and elect delegates to the constitutional conventions mandated by Congress. African Americans made up about 3/5 of the state's population, and the delegates they elected wrote a constitution that prohibited slavery, established a non-racial franchise, and for the first time provided for representation by total population rather than by wealth. White population, or the old federal 3/5 ratio. Under that Constitution, South Carolina's adult men assembled in June 1868 and elected a Republican government. Black majority districts like Edgefield not only polled strong Republican majorities, but also often elected black men to state and local office. Over the course of Reconstruction, such voters would ultimately put hundreds of black men into state and federal office. More than half of these men had been slaves in 1861. Freed people moved to secure their independence by acquiring land. Against substantial ideological and political obstacles, South Carolina's Reconstruction government went farther than that of any other state in attempting to redistribute land from the former masters to the former slaves. Through a new state agency, the South Carolina Land Commission, Republicans hoped to transfer acreage forfeited for non-payment of taxes to poor South Carolinians on relatively easy terms. In hindsight, it was an uphill struggle. Even sympathetic Northern Republicans generally endorsed contractual forms of wage labor as a logical first step for freed people, and federal proposals to confiscate and redistribute Southern lands encountered widespread opposition from a broad range of Democrats and Republicans. Freed people of necessity turned to other arrangements, including sharecropping, in which agricultural households provided a year's labor on land they did not own in exchange for the profits on a fixed proportion of the crop they produced, minus, of course, whatever a landlord or merchant had advanced to them during the year. It was a far cry from independent proprietorship, and it left renters and laborers at the mercy of their creditors. The Republican Revolution did not transform the freed people into a black yeomanry, but it did create new institutions and social context in which black and white Southerners might learn to see each other as allies or even equals. Manhood suffrage fostered biracial political institutions. Some whites as well as blacks bought land from the state, and other whites became merchants and provided freed people with supplies on credit, undercutting planters' economic hold on laborers and renters. Republicans drove more fissures into the edifice of white unity when they stripped prerogatives from the white elite, underlining the fact that not all Southern whites shared the same stake in prior social arrangements. The admission of black students to the state college, for example, mainly offended only those white men who had been privileged enough to attend it. White Republicans gave the lie to white patriarchal solidarity. Planters dubbed Northern-born white Republicans carpetbaggers, likening them to the antebellum era's itinerant hawkers of dubious banknotes. The analogy seemed apt, for from a slaveholder's perspective, Northern-born Republicans had in effect created fiat citizens, a worthless majority whose suffrage and office holding debased the party. As one anti-Reconstruction newspaper protested, these interlopers were political adventurers who wished to use the Negro to sustain their unlawful and unjust usurpations of power.
but the Republican Party nevertheless began to gain support among a wide range of native-born white Southerners. Some elite men joined the party in hopes of moderating its course and serving as its new leadership, among them James L. Orr, who had been elected governor by the state's first post-war legislature in late 1865. Non-elite white republicanism, however, was an elephant of a different color. Most white Republicans were men who had lacked significant power in the pre-emancipation social order. Urban artisans, poor farmers, and dissidents and mavericks of all descriptions. Some seem to have taken the opportunity to remake themselves completely, like the former slave trader Joe Cruz, who became a fiery Republican orator. Their new party allegiance raised troubling possibilities if poor white men began to see black laborers as political allies rather than potential insurrectionaries. If white male solidarity gave way to divisions of class, the edifice of planter rule might collapse entirely. Black majority states such as South Carolina, white men's ballots alone could not determine the outcome of elections. If more than a few white men defected, the planter cause would become hopeless. The Republicans opened up space for the airing of new and long-suppressed social grievances within white society. The white population that had never owned slaves, the poor and middling majority of white South Carolinians, had suffered great hardships over the past half-decade, and it was not difficult for them to hold the planter elite responsible. Without regretting that they had once hired or borrowed slaves, white men of limited means could now express animosity towards those slave owners, the men who had spearheaded the drive to secession and emerged from the disastrous war with their land holdings largely intact. Challengers to the elite now went beyond individual acts of theft or arson, calling for debtor relief legislation. The members of an 1866 meeting in white-majority Pickens County declared that the people had a right to look for relief to men of place and position whose influence on their actions had produced such conditions. Poor and middling white men were neither abolitionists nor champions of free labor ideology, but under the difficult conditions of post-bellum era, they might perhaps be recruited into a Republican coalition that offered them the means to recover their independence. But the revolution of Reconstruction simultaneously undercut white men's expectations of authority as white and as men, presenting challenges to those forging new coalitions. Wherever white men turned in the post-1868 South, they found they had lost their long-standing monopoly on political and market relations. With black men and an electoral majority and white and black Republican men holding most state and local offices, black men and women gained new civil and criminal prosecutions and began to make use of courts and laws. The lower house of the South Carolina legislature, an institution that had stood near the center of white men's historic authority, even had an outright black majority. This new legislature reshaped the laws governing labor, and for a time, agricultural laborers enjoyed the first legal claim or lien on the crops they helped produce. But the revolution did more than alter the political and economic significance of race. As Republicans expanded married women's rights of property and contract and enacted the state's first divorce law, men's formal authority over women grew less absolute. Local women suffrage movements emerged, led primarily by black women.
and in a step that symbolized the new government's disdain for all barriers of caste, the legislature legalized racial intermarriage. When white opponents referred to these Republicans as radicals, then they were correct. For South Carolina society, equal citizenship was truly a radical notion. Interpreting these changes in the context of post-bellum economic hardship, many white men came to understand Reconstruction as a plot against the ordering principles of white patriarchal authority. Many found the influx of black bodies and the recognition of black voices intensely disquieting. The initial shock might appear to have worn off after seating one crowned juror late in 1868. Edgefield's Court of General Sessions soon ceased noting the race of men called to serve, but the sense that a revolution had taken place was more lasting. A shared investment in whiteness had never fully obscured the class differences among white men or created an unproblematic white unity, but white men had learned to see themselves as the natural ruling group and to define themselves against the inherently unqualified, which mostly meant African Americans. Despite the potential for new alliances and allegiances, Reconstruction republicanism could not simply erase the fiction of racial interests and substitute the reality of class solidarity. The expectation of white male privilege survived. Emancipation unshackled blackness from slavery, but it could not erase the centuries of racialized subordination that had made blackness a marker of social inferiority and subjugation. White Americans' shared understanding of the meaning of whiteness and blackness therefore remained an important cultural resource on which planners could draw in their struggle against Reconstruction. Freed people's ascent during the late 1860s created a feeling of wrenching transformation and deep loss among white Southerners that frequently overrode any possible benefits. White men did not have to share the planters' precise understanding of the meaning of white supremacy in order to support the return to normal rules and roles that such a slogan evoked. White men's adjustment to black people's new roles would have been traumatic under any circumstances, but freed people's rise to citizenship took place in the immediate aftermath of a devastating war and under the administration of the occupying army. Simultaneously, a series of ruinous harvests exacerbated economic difficulties, and although planners had some historical reasons to feel attached, if only economically, to black Southerners, non-slaveholders had few such reasons to form attachments and many more recent ones to see former slaves and former free blacks as the agents and clients of the Yankee invaders and another group of agricultural workers competing for suddenly scarce resources. Furthermore, the expanded state government established by the Republicans was costly compared to the extremely limited governments of the pre-war era. The region's historically low tax rates on land soared during Reconstruction, a change that resulted in the forfeiture of some large holdings. Republican tax and land policies infuriated and terrified wealthy families like the Tillmans, who correctly understood them as efforts to split large plantations into small freeholds for poor families and to collect revenue to finance social services that would primarily benefit the freed people. Substantial increases in state and local taxation could chip away at large landholding and the wealth, credit, and power they represented. Increased taxation also created fear and hardship among hard-pressed smaller landowners. Even without burdensome taxes, many white farmers were closer to landless poverty than they had been at any time in recent memory. By 1870, 43% of Edgefield households headed by white men owned no real estate.
This was slightly higher than the total percentage of landless white households in 1850, a percentage that had also included landless white female-headed households, and it was especially high compared to 1860, when only 25% of white households had been landless. The fact that South Carolina's Reconstruction government failed to transcend the rampant venality of its era made these taxes seem even more onerous. Along with these new sources of fear and anxiety, an old one lived on: the expectation that black freedom was synonymous with slave revolt. The non-uprising of Christmas 1865 did not allay such fears among white Southerners. In the summer of 1866, planners in Orangeburg County pieced together what they believed to be a conspiracy among black military companies to assemble early in September and kill every white man they could find and take what they wanted. The political campaign of 1868 raised such fears to a new pitch. From Georgia, Sally Tillman, a woman with no shortage of plantation experience, urged Ben to take care while he finished packing up the Florida household. "Darling, do be particular and don't get into any difficulty with the Negroes," she wrote. "I shall be so uneasy till I hear from you." Insisting that she did not anticipate anything like an outbreak, the lady did perhaps protest too much. She and her new husband had already weathered at least one insurrection scare in Florida earlier that year, during which several blacks had been jailed, and Tillman had considered sending her back to the relative safety of South Carolina. The war against Reconstruction. Leading Edgefield political figures George Tillman and Martin Gary sought to bolster white supremacy against the corrosive forces of change, believing that the land, labor, and lives of the colored races were, by common consent, articles of free trade among Caucasians everywhere. George Tillman warned that black independence spelled the end of white civilization. Pugnacious Gary framed this racial vision in more explicitly militant terms, arguing that there were once an irrepressible conflict between free labor and slave labor had existed. Now there was only a conflict between the Caucasian and African races. A renewed civil war, presumably, would put not South against North, but white against black. Pulling themselves from the wreck of racial slavery, the planters had begun to articulate a new argument about the continuing significance of race, one that directly challenged the ongoing revolution. Counter-revolutionary mobilization against Reconstruction emerged piecemeal between 1868 and 1876 as elite white men pursued mutually supporting strategies to regain control of the state government and the labor force. The political efforts of the Union, Reform, and Democratic parties and of agricultural reform movements and tax protest conventions existed side by side and worked hand in hand with the violent activities of the Ku Klux Klan, rifle clubs, and other paramilitary organizations. All proceeded from the assumptions that black political activity was inherently corrupt and that black employment should be restricted to agricultural labor under annual contracts. All took as their starting point the hostility and frustration Tillman expressed toward the new status and aspirations of the gentleman from Africa. In the end, economic resources and the willingness to use them aggressively determined who won each contest. Planters' control of farmland, the state's primary economic resource, gave them power over largely landless and impoverished ex-slaves. By coercive means such as eviction and denial of supplies, as well as outright physical violence, Tillman and his fellow planters attempted to reduce the free people to disenfranchised laborers. The free people fought back, aided, however, falteringly by the legal and military resources of the state and federal governments. In many white-majority southern states, redemption had triumphed by the early 1870s, but Republicans in black majority states such as South Carolina did not surrender so quickly. Nor did the freed people's own efforts cease with their abandonment by the federal government in 1877. The resistance to Reconstruction took well-organized, violent form even before the Republican governments came to power. The Tillman's home county of Edgefield became a center of anti-Reconstruction activism, and George Tillman helped lead local and state efforts to restore planter rule. In the summer of 1868, as Ben Tillman spent his last miserable months in Florida, other white Edgefield men organized to prevent Republicans from taking power and to punish black laborers who voted Republican. Through economic sanctions, intimidation, and murder, white landowners made it economically and physically unhealthy to participate in Republican politics or to seek economic autonomy. Terror served landowners very well. Masked terrorists known as the Ku Klux Klan punished freed people and their allies for acts of political or economic independence, but not all vigilantism was hooded. Abelville County Democratic leader and planter D. Wyatt Aiken publicly urged the murder of the district's newly elected black Republican state senator. As Aiken had hoped, Benjamin F. Randolph was shot dead soon afterward at the Abelville train station. As one of the assassins later told investigators, the goals of Klan terror were to regulate the Republican Party, break it up if they could, and strengthen the Democratic Party. Randolph was one of 19 black Republican and Union League leaders murdered during the 1868 election campaign in the state's 3rd congressional district. White men also mobilized militarily to prevent the November 1868 federal election from taking place in Edgefield County. Some of these men then traveled to neighboring Abelville County to bolster its Democrats and to help them prevent Republicans from voting. As a result, less than 20% of Abelville's black voting majority cast ballots. Abelville's totals and the forced silence of Edgefield's active black majority helped elect a Democratic representative in the Upcountry District. Landowners also attempted to co-opt their Republican foes. By the time the 1870 campaign began, disgruntled combatants in the state's fractious Republican politics joined with planter leaders to form the Union Reform Party, whose statewide ticket included Matthew Butler for lieutenant governor. At the local level, this movement resulted in a brief political peace as black Republican and white Democratic leaders mounted a single compromise ticket for local government. Although Edgefield's biracial fusion county ticket was elected in the spring, the statewide Union Reform ticket lost by a substantial margin, roughly equivalent to the state's proportion of black to white voters. Many Republican leaders, as this suggests, remained skeptical of the intentions of such allies. As a low-country Republican paper put it in the 1870s, some of these are good, true men. Some only came to us from the most selfish motives. These last so much want place and power that they would be anything to secure it. We must be watchful and trust no Democrat who joins us till we know him to be an out-and-out, thorough radical from conviction. Edgefield's Republican fusionists would have done well to heed such warnings. Shortly after the 1870 election, Edgefield Union Reform Party Chair Lewis Jones, a white landowner, became president of a network of planter paramilitary clubs dubbed the Edgefield County Agricultural and Police Society. The group's name, recalling the slave control efforts of the antebellum Beach Island planters, reflected the continuing link between political and economic authority. No man better embodied that linkage than D. Wyatt Aiken, the Abelville planter who had successfully called for the assassination of Benjamin F. Randolph. As the editor of a planter agricultural journal, the Rural Carolinian, Aiken sought to reconstruct the antebellum plantation economy to suit the post-emancipation world. He understood, as did many of his readers, that the essential first step in dealing with free labor was to place as many limits on its freedom as possible. In the journal, Aiken offered his Aidville plantation as a model of the post-bellum plantation system. Aiken's workers, all black families, had to pay their rent in cotton, which limited the amount of food they could raise and placed them at the mercy of the poor post-bellum cotton market. In a gesture toward paternalist ideals, Aiken gave his workers land on which to erect a church. He most likely provided supplies on credit, for it's difficult to imagine this planter allowing an outside merchant to intrude into the relationship between him and his people. This post-bellum plantation bore a strong resemblance to the antebellum version. Despite evident changes, there were still laborers' cabins for black families, a gin for the obligatory cotton crop, and at the center, a main house occupied by a single white family. This was what Ben Tillman had tried to achieve in Florida, and despite his failure there, what he ultimately sought throughout his agricultural career. At least a few readers of the rural Carolinian understood that the adjustment from slave to free labor could not be anything but painful. The abolition of slavery, declared one, has affected our social, moral, educational, economical, political, and to a certain extent even our religious relations. Slavery so ramified, it was so interlaced throughout the body politic that we cannot expect the laceration caused by suddenly tearing it out by the roots can be as suddenly healed. This writer's thoughtful analysis went hand in hand with an affirmation of continuing hierarchies. A few lines later, he proposed a series of measures to place the Southern landholder in a more prosperous condition than he has ever before occupied. Planters must live on their properties to ensure the proper cultivation of the land and oversee the Negro, who cannot be bound by contracts. Planters and their families must also work, although it would be wrong to demoralize our sons by forcing them to work in the fields with the Negroes. This last, of course, flew in the face of most white households' reality. Even men like Tillman had been working in their own fields throughout Reconstruction. In less prosperous households, white women also worked the fields, but the ideal of keeping black agricultural labor under the supervision of white male landowners retained its force. Sharecropping, to the degree that it fostered black autonomy, was deplored as an unwilling concession to the freedman's desires to become a proprietor, or the planter's inability to make prompt payments of wages in cash. In the early 1870s, Aiken set about mobilizing his readers for somewhat different efforts on behalf of landholders and white supremacy. As the local agent of the patrons of husbandry that are known as the Grange, he initiated a statewide organization to reform agriculture. By the mid-1870s, he had established hundreds of local Granges statewide. The Grange embodied Aiken's desire for unity among planters against both laborers and merchants. Grangers engaged in collective purchasing and worked to establish a common and well-regulated system of labor contracts. Noting that freedmen, like other groups, had been demonstrated to us the power of concert and effect of union through their political and economic organizations from the neighborhood to the state level, Aiken urged profiting by their example. Grange activities intended to bolster the post-bellum plantation system slid naturally and in South Carolina perhaps inevitably into the violent enforcement of that system. In the early 1870s, Edgefield's agricultural and police clubs pursued many of the strategies urged by Aiken and other Grange leaders. Led by George Tillman and others, planters agreed to set common wages and contractual terms, to refuse to hire laborers away from other planters, and to ostracize whites who violated these agreements or rented land to blacks. Such plans, of course, were more easily prescribed than enforced. as planters vied for the dependable laborers during crucial parts of the growing season. Individual and class economic imperatives came into direct conflict, but nearly every planter shared Aiken's avowed commitment to one essential principle: if any man occupy his land as his equal, it must be after his death. Militant defiance remained a cardinal planter virtue. Planter organizations drew strength from this ideological coherence. Intellectual, military, economic, and political groups shared overlapping and complementary aims. Agricultural and police clubs made the connections explicit, but even where organizations retained apparently discrete identities, their leadership overlapped. In Edgefield and elsewhere, many of the same names appeared on the rosters of Granges, conventions, and later rifle clubs. For example, leaders of the Edgefield Granges included two delegates to the 1871 Taxpayers Convention called to protest Republican taxation. When the Taxpayers Convention reassembled in 1874, Edgefield was represented by many of the same men who had attended in 1871, including paramilitary leaders Matthew Butler and Martin Gary, as well as by a new generation of Grange masters. Had the Klan kept records, the overlap between Grange and Klan membership would doubtless have been equally significant. The connections were obvious to Republican opponents who recognized that whatever they called themselves, planter-led organizations shared the same goals. White elites led the war against Reconstruction just as they had led the militias, the white committees, and the Confederate mobilization. Former Confederate general, Democratic leader, and planter Wade Hampton was a leading organizer in a statewide movement to raise money and engage lawyers to defend supposed Klansmen. White terrorists, according to their wives, had been ordered off to one clash with militiamen. The anti-Reconstruction mobilization, reported one observer, was a complete military organization. Although elite men sometimes portrayed Klan violence as the acts of lower orders of white men, the Klan's membership cut across white society and had allies at its very pinnacle. When Klan violence surged again in 1870 and 1871, white Republican Governor Robert Scott finally armed and mobilized a state militia. This force took its membership from the marching societies and Union League companies that had defended the lives and interests of black South Carolinians since the fall of the Confederacy. Some of these companies had armed themselves and stood their ground during the first wave of Klan violence in 1868. In many areas of the state, militia units patrolled to prevent Klan outrages, sometimes demanding the kinds of explanations from white men that white men historically had demanded from slaves. Although nearly all militia members were black, a few white Republicans, such as Lawrence County Joe Cruz, assumed positions of authority. Black martial mobilizations inspired an overwhelming response. Whenever black militia units appeared, their very existence as a body of armed black men provoked the same mass mobilization of white men that rumors of slave revolts had prompted. A great majority of those white men had years of Confederate service. Moreover, having been free their entire lives, they had networks throughout the region on which they could draw. This placed serious limits on the militia's ability to retaliate against the Ku Klux Klan, defend the rights of citizens, and sustain the authority of Republican officials. In the winter and spring of 1871, after a militia unit in Chester County fought off Klan attacks, hundreds of white men converged on Chester under the leadership of former Confederate officers. Although the militiamen managed to retreat safely, a large-scale racial battle could easily have occurred, an outcome the white Republican governor desperately sought to avoid. Militia resistance to the Klan sparked similarly dangerous conflicts in other upcountry counties as well. Cruz and his militia had to flee to Lawrence County when hundreds of armed mounted white men arrived from Edgefield and elsewhere. The virtual state of war finally brought federal occupation and trials in several upcountry counties in 1871, teaching Klan leaders that they needed at least to appear law-abiding. But when congressional investigators called Matthew Butler before them in July 1871, even as he delivered testimony designed to avoid implicating himself, he articulated his assumption that he and his class ought to control the state. Although he denied that he played any role in the Klan, he emphasized how much influence he had on the white men of his county. Indeed, he suggested that his own authority was more legitimate than that of the state's Republican elected officials. After he had raised a military company and offered its services to the state, he complained the Republican governor had refused the offer. This suggested to Butler that the governor, Scott, misunderstood the relationship between the state and men of Butler's class. Until Scott has treated them with respect, Butler explained, he cannot expect their cooperation. This was, in essence, the philosophical underpinning of the elite-led rebellion against Reconstruction. Certain men were entitled to pass judgment on state politics and unilaterally to veto those which they disapproved. The owner of 2,200 acres, Butler explained that he represented a group of men who have a right to know and be heard. There is always a moral power with that class of people which entitles them to respect. Butler knew better than to claim that he was entitled to establish his own militia. Instead, he focused on the other half of the planter dialectic of authority, emphasizing his capacity for forbearance. Here, as always, the threat of violence was implicit. Last summer, he told the committee, I could easily have provoked a riot in 10 minutes, but I have taken legal rather than violent means. Although he denied organizing Klan activity, he could not resist asserting once again his capacity to organize and mobilize white men through less formal understandings. He dismissed the Klan raid at Lawrence as a sort of spontaneous thing, but added that he had advised some young men to go. He denied the existence of an Edgefield Klan, but admitted the existence of informal organizations, which he described as touching of elbows to be ready for any emergency. Pressed by the congressman as to the intentions of whites in South Carolina, where they accepted Butler's neat division of whites and blacks into separate and competing groups, he acknowledged a very universal determination to overcome the Negro majority. Others offered their Republican opponents the choice between surgical acts of violence against particular individuals and more random, bloodier conflicts with white mobs. In a speech to the 1874 Taxpayers Convention, one delegate defended the Klan's actions as justifiable responses to outrages against justice by black criminals that had gone unpunished by the Republican authorities. White men, he explained, had banded together for mutual protection, but the Republicans had fostered a climate of lawlessness in which such organizations could develop in either of two directions, according to the relative numbers, intelligence, or morality participating. The choices were revolution or brigandage. When outrage and abuses against black South Carolinians occurred, it was the fault of brigands. In those cases, the Ku Klux appears to have been mainly a body of ignorant men and as devoid of justice as they were of judgment. When mob ignorance was tempered by the greater intelligence of more respectable whites, by contrast, the black pawns of Reconstruction did not suffer. Instead, the revolutionaries dealt with the white persons that organized the frauds and violence of which they justly complained and made an example in high quarters in Columbia. In other words, lower-class white men could not be expected to know who their real enemies were. They sought justice, but in doing so, they acted like a mob. A better class of white men would have aimed directly at the leaders of the illegitimate party. More than a retrospective apology for some Klan excesses, this was an outline for future assaults on Republican governance. Butler himself had helped lead the first Taxpayers' Convention in May of 1871. There, the very best people had been represented by an array of antebellum and Confederate leaders, and the convention's president had complained that they who lay the taxes do not pay them, and they who are to pay them have no voice in the laying of them. Can greater wrong or greater tyranny in Republican government be well conceived? Less evils than this have produced revolution. Allusions to the Republican legacies of the American Revolution coexisted comfortably with attacks on popular democracy. Gary, who chaired the convention's Committee on Electoral Reform, described universal suffrage as an invitation to demagoguery. Another wealthy Edgefieldian urged amending the state constitution so that representation of property might once again restrain popular democracy. Others suggested a cumulative system of voting which would offer political minorities, in this case white men, greater opportunities for representation. More concrete proposals for reducing the planters' tax burden were subverted by convention members, including Butler and Gary, who cooperated with anxious bond speculators by declaring the state's existing debt to be legitimate, not the product of Republican frauds. Rifle clubs and riots. Despite such pursuits of individual interest, the anti-Republicans did not suffer from division as badly as did the Republicans themselves. More than half of the officials elected during Reconstruction in South Carolina were black, but this group neither spoke with one voice nor wielded power proportionate to its numbers or potential constituency. Many black South Carolinian Reconstruction leaders, born free in the North or South, lacked intuitive understanding of their impoverished constituents' needs. This internally divided black leadership also faced challenges from generally more conservative white Republicans. At the same time, lagging federal prosecutions of accused Klansmen reflected a weakening federal commitment to the state's elected government. National Republican leaders feared the political consequences of using federal power, military rule, and the suspension of habeas corpus against civilians. As bad as it was to be considered the party of the black man, it might be even worse to be seen as the party of federal tyranny. Still, when faced with a powerful challenge, the fractured party usually managed to rally. In a stinging reply to the accusations of the 1874 Taxpayers' Convention, the state Republican Central Committee denied that tax policies were deliberately confiscatory and criticized antebellum undertaxation of landed property for encouraging the formation of that most dangerous of all oligarchies, a landed aristocracy. It was from this class, it noted, that secession and the war sprang. The Republican leadership understood the taxpayers' efforts as one in a series of political, military, and ideological attempts by the former ruling elegant to regain power. First, they expected it through the election of Seymour and Blair, the 1868 Democratic presidential ticket. Second, through the midnight murders and assassination of Ku Kluxism, and now thirdly by the distortion and misrepresentation of facts in order to create a public sentiment in their favor. Although riven by schisms and class conflict, Republican leaders could still accurately assess the motives and methods of their opponents.
And we will pick up there next Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. We will be on page 61. 61, we are still pretty early in the book. Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial, 760-569-7676. The code, 564. #943#. Press *6 if you would like to participate. I did find the quotes, both of the quotes that came up during the first study session. Let's see, number 1 on page 38. Oops. The quote where Karma said it sounded like The Art of War essay on politeness, the youngest son, talking about Ben Tillman, was already clearly trying out the role of paternalist gentleman, imagining how he might acquire the social grace that rendered a superior amiable, unequal agreeable, and an inferior acceptable. There we go. I think there was one more that I got as well, but I'll go ahead and get to the callers if they have things they would like to share. Everybody who has a hand up, the line should be open. Feel free to chime in, and please do not wait until the last minute if you think you have something you would like to share. The folks that have a hand up should be with us. I'm not sure. I know there were some issues before where I thought the people's lines were open, but they were not. But it looks like people's lines should be open. Like I heard one person.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I didn't get much of the second half because I had an emergency in the family. But one thing I would say about these races, they are thinking ahead because of that so-called fear. You know, when they have a fear of something, they're thinking ahead, they go ahead and make those provisions to offset that ahead of time. And so we have to be aware that they're constantly on their job, and we have to be about ours. I'll mute my line.
Right on. Hope things have worked out all right. You have taken care if there was a problem. See the caller at 5234. You should be with us as well as everyone who had a hand up from the first time around. You should be with us also.
All right. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
All right. Greetings to the previous caller. I wish you all the best. I hope everything is okay. I just wanted to touch on two things. On page 53, George Tillman actually they think that he equates black independence with the destruction of white civilization. To me, this is the crux of white supremacy. Anything that has to do with black liberation is going to, in their mind, destroy everything that they've built on the backs of black people. So I think that's the clearest indication of the fact that subjugation of black people is the number one aim of white supremacy, and that's the only way that the society as we see it today can function, which is why we have to end it and replace white supremacy with justice. And then on page 55, Aiken stated that he wanted to refashion, let me pull it out. Aiken sought to reconstruct the antebellum plantation economy to suit the post-emancipation world. So in other words, he wanted to basically refashion slavery to fit the world that they were in at that time. And that goes back, in my mind, to the prison industrial complex. And that's basically another refashioning of the system again to suit the whims of modern society. So those are two poignant points that I just wanted to, that stood out to me that I just wanted to make. And thank you very much for taking my call. I'll mute my line.
Appreciate that. Right on. The other folks that are with us, Joe, if you all either are in a noisy spot or if you didn't have any comments either, that's fine as well. I'm just making sure I didn't miss anybody, any of the other folks that had a hand up. Right on. I will check in before we sign off, just make sure, some of the folks, so yeah, there's something wacky with the, I don't even see your hand. Thomas in New York said he had a hand up, but I don't even see him. I'm not sure if he got disconnected. Yeah, Thomas in New York. Oh, there he is. I see you. Okay. Alrighty, there we go. Are you with us, Tom?
I forgot to hit *6. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, man. What the last caller just said, yeah, it's the fuck. So it's like, if we can't have these niggas working for us, then there's really no purpose for them. And you know, what really gets me is, man, the terror around voting. Man, I mean, it was like, listen, we're gonna put the government in place we want to put in, regardless of what anyone says, you know, and formulating terrorist groups like the KKK and those other groups, those militia, former Confederate groups, just to hinder black people from voting for a Republican. It just, you know, and especially when you look at the way how they did the New Black Panthers when they tried to, you know, stand at the polls and things. I mean, just totally villainized them. But the whole thing is built on that. You know, it's terrible. And the inefficiency of the black people to really police the white people. You know, the black militia. I think at least they tried. And I don't see any difference today. I don't think they'll ever let the black cops actually really police the white people while they're in the black neighborhoods. And I'll leave my line. Thank you. You guys should do a great job reading.
I don't appreciate. Hopefully the got a new microphone today off my wish list, so I haven't even got to try out my new audio equipment. So hopefully that'll improve the audio reading for next week. Great point about the Ben Tillman. That's one of the things that I was thinking, like when I was hearing this, and just because of the terms that I use, like it's just real stark. Like it's no pussyfooting. It's not white privilege and all this other, not the terrorism, white supremacy, boom, boom, boom. Like it's just so naked and flagrant what it is. It's refreshing. Like when they're just saying, this is what it is, and this is, it is insufferable to think that I got a nigger guarding me. I really, really appreciate that. Like, I think like that just makes it so much easier to just get right to the point about what we're talking about and what you think and what your motivation is for all of this. To the point that Thomas in New York just brought up, I feel like, and she's a victim. She does have a white parent, but she's a victim, Melissa Harris Perry. I feel like if she or a number of other black people were facilitating this book study session, they would really connect that. Like they would really drive that home, like all of the terrorism that was focused around voting and intimidation and in fact, pause. I will make sure I get back to my point, but just for state senator and the former pastor of Mother Emanuel A.M.E, Clementa Pinckney, the portion, it's on page 50, is it 54? Make sure I get that out. Yes, page 54, where they're talking about this is an elected black state senator in South Carolina. Yes, terror served landowners well. Just that's what I mean. Call it what terror served landowners, whites well. Masked terrorists known as the Ku Klux Klan punished freed people and their allies for acts of political or economic independence. But not all vigilantism was hooded. Abbeville County Democratic leader and planter D. Wyatt Aiken publicly urged the murder of Democratic leader of D. White Aiken publicly urged the murder of the district's newly elected black Republican state senator, as Aiken had hoped Benjamin F. Randolph was shot dead soon afterward at the Abbeville train station. Just the long history. I don't know. I had not heard his name before. Benjamin F. Randolph. I'd never heard of him or known anything about him, but I feel like that should have been brought up as well. Maybe I just haven't seen the stories that South Carolina has a history of assassinating black elected officials, and particularly state senators. I feel like that should have brought it. Maybe it has. I'll check on Google before we conclude to see if people have. But I immediately thought of State Senator Reverend Clementa Pinckney. But back to my point that I was saying, if Melissa Harris Perry or any number of other black people, they would really play that up. Like, there's a history, long history in this book documenting of terrorism, white terrorism, to keep black people from voting. And that's the same thing that you see now with voter ID and these other laws to explicitly keep black people from voting. And that's why when you have people like former NAACP President Melvin Poole say that, black people not voting and, this is ridiculous and all this stuff that's happening. I totally see the logic, right, that they present. But I mean, it's important, like documenting that we are reading this book. It's important, but I just don't have the same emphasis. I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but I just don't have the same zeal for it now, because I feel like white people have kind of figured out how to codify that too. If black people do vote, that's still not going to solve the problem. Anyway, some of the other things that I thought were really significant in the second portion of the reading on page 51. Let's see. White Americans' shared understanding of the meaning of whiteness and blackness therefore remained an important cultural resource on which planters could draw in their struggle against Reconstruction. Everything about this paragraph is just, so that's sentence one. White Americans' shared understanding of the meanings of whiteness and blackness therefore remained an important cultural resource on which planters could draw in their struggle against Reconstruction. That is huge for so many reasons. When I say all the time that white people are not ignorant about racism, this sentence goes even further to say that white understanding of racism, what it means to be white, how you're supposed to think about black people, that not only are they informed, but their shared understanding of racism is a cultural asset, a cultural resource, which I totally agree. It absolutely is. I mean, when you can get a group of people where everybody is kind of on the same page about what's happening and what you're supposed to be doing as a group, oh my, you can do lots. You can do tons. And white people, they fight, they argue. We've seen tons of examples of that. Ben Tillman, some of his brothers have killed other white people. But they have that shared cultural resource of understanding we are white, and what we're supposed to be doing on this planet is dominating niggers everywhere. Like, that is amazing. Next sentence, he says, freed people's ascent during the late 1860s created a feeling of wrenching transformation and deep loss among white Southerners that frequently overrode any possible benefits. That's astronomical, and it goes right back to the point the previous caller just said about how black liberation represents the end of white. So I mean, that's what I said about it. Just, it is so clear, and I've heard other people say that when you can go back and kind of study earlier forms of racism, a lot of times it's a lot less refined. It's just very, very naked and raw what it is, which I really appreciate that. Anyway, but that is huge. And I mean, particularly the last part of the sentence, no possible benefit. It doesn't matter. If anything good comes out of these niggers being in charge, it's niggers in charge. Like, that's, I don't care what happens. It's niggers in charge. Next sentence. White men did not have to share the planners' precise understanding of the meaning of white supremacy in order to support the return to normal rules and roles that such a slogan evoked. That, I mean, that I don't even need to say anymore. Like, we as white people don't even have to have the exact same definition. We don't even have to have an identical concept for white supremacy. As long as we kind of got the basics, we're supposed to be dominating those niggers. Right on. We are. That is just amazing. I might be talking loony, but that entire paragraph just, wow, that says so much. Next on page 56. Page 56. Ooh, what a quote. Okay, this starts actually at the bottom of 55. At least a few readers of the rural Carolinian understood that the adjustment from slave to free labor could not be anything but painful. The abolition of slavery, declared one, has affected our social, moral, educational, economical, political, and to a certain extent even our religious relations. Slavery so ramified, it was so interlaced throughout the body politic that we cannot expect the laceration caused by suddenly tearing it out by the roots can be suddenly healed. I would just replace, or if, as long as you understand that white supremacy, racism is slavery, you could replace the term, but I mean, that is astronomical statement, because the author almost lists every area of people activity under Mr. Fuller's 9 areas, and particularly I highlighted religion, the religion of white supremacy. Very important passage as well, I thought. When they were talking about the Grange, this is also on 56, when he said that this group that started out, they were supposed to be doing some sort of agricultural reform and looking out for white people. He says that it naturally and perhaps even inevitably descended into violence, and probably violence against black people, but we didn't really get further enough along. But I'm assuming that's where it inevitably went, was violence against black people, which to me goes back to Ben Tillman's suggestion that white people have some sort of innate inclination towards violence, white supremacist violence against black people in particular. The next one on, I guess this will be my last one, make sure other folks don't have anything they want to get in. I was going to ask, since they did mention Joe Cruz, he was one of the quote-unquote radical white Republicans. I guess he was the, like, Timothy Wise of his era, where he was hanging out with the black people during Reconstruction and allegedly trying to help them do something constructive, and even participated in armed guards. I was going to ask if people thought anything, what of Joe Cruz? What do you make of this individual white dude? And on 57, if there's anything quickly, I'll get in before I check, see if other folks have any comments. I thought there was a lot of really good material in the second half of the book, second part of the audio reading. Let's see, 57. Oh yeah, the code. They have a white code. Let's see where it says, talking about these granges that were established, that they had plans, of course. They were more easily prescribed than enforced, as planters vied for dependable laborers. During crucial parts of the growing season, individual class and economic imperatives came into direct conflict, but nearly every planter shared Aiken's avowed commitment to one essential principle: if any man occupy his land as his equal, it must be after his death. That's not the exact quote I wanted, but they were just talking about the codification of not renting to black. Yeah, there it is. Led by George Tillman and others, planters agreed to set common wages and contractual terms to refuse to hire laborers away from other planters and to ostracize whites who violated these agreements or rented land to blacks. Again, just that codification. If you're a white person, you cannot be ignorant about racism. You will get in trouble with other white people if you violate the white code. Particularly if you're doing things that you're not supposed to directly with black people. I mean, whoa, they will let you know in a heartbeat. There were a few other things, but I'll stop there. Folks have other comments they want to make sure they get in. Feel free. I don't know if folks, nothing else stood out, or if they just didn't have anything else they wanted to share, which is, that's fine too if folks are satisfied. But yeah.
Those passages you just read, you talk about that one where he went through pretty much all the areas of people activity. Like you said, when you were reading, during the reading session, the even case of religion. I mean, that was like, wow, I don't see white supremacy ending. I just think that what they've done over time is the things that are sticking out to us that sound, ooh, that's brutal. They just found a way to make us accept it. It's legal now, It's legal for us to not get the same wage. It's legal for us not to be able to own land, especially in certain places, own houses. I mean, they just found ways to legalize it. And maybe that's what they mean by the Reconstruction of white supremacy. I mean, the way they were outright practicing it is now being practiced just in a way that we all accept it,
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
I just want to say, if this is just the beginning and we haven't even gotten to the crux of the book, I think this book is incredible. It's just outlining everything in detail, and I think it's because of the time frame in which this happened. Whites were way more free with their racism, white supremacy, and just, like you said, it was just open and honest, because at that point we were so in such a depressed condition that they didn't really have to codify that much. Now that the situation has changed as much as it has for us, even though it hasn't changed much as far as just our so-called freedom to move around in the country, so-called, I think the codification, as far as the fact that slavery is no longer overt, it's now so much more multi-layered that here they make it plain as day. I think this book is going to continue to be an incredible read. And I'll meet my line there.
Yeah, I'm very excited. It's still a white author. Like I said, we should, definitely keep our ears alert. For people that are reading along, keep your eyes alert for influence that this is a white writer, likely race soldier, as we roll along to kind of put that out. But I think when it's that time period and you're talking about this person who is just so proud and flagrant in his dedication to white power, that white terrorism, that it just makes it very clear you don't have to do as much work. You don't have a whole lot of pussyfooting and them using a lot of words to obfuscate and try to hide the truth of the matter. I just it's great. And we really haven't even gotten into. I mean, just to kind of put it in context, where we are in the book right now, we're kind of at like the early 1870s. Ben Tillman didn't die until almost like 1920. So we haven't even like his career as governor and senator and all the stuff he was doing, the Hamburg massacre, that we haven't even got to. Like I think he's only about 20 or so at the point where we are in the book. He got married and he's about 20. So I mean, he's still very, very young. We really haven't even got to the crux of why, as I said before, why he has all these statues that they won't take down and all the other stuff. So yeah, we have the best parts are yet to come. I was going to read some of the stuff that I found in doing research, but I had to stop because I just said, man, I'm just hopping ahead of the book because I think this stuff is there. We just haven't got to it yet, but stay tuned. It should be coming. Anything else folks wanted to get in before we wrap up?
It does. So why not the cowbells for Strom Thurmond?
Oh yeah, they definitely should be there. Sometimes I'll be saying it so quick that I can't get it up, but that absolutely is warranted, and I wish I had the time and space to get that mentioned, because I did reference him in an article that I wrote recently about all this, but I didn't get in that he spent all this time talking about how we should stay away from the niggers, and he's as soon as the sun goes down, he's on the black side of town. In bed, tragic arrangement the whole way, but absolutely he is worthy.
And I bet it's some cowbells from Ben Tillman too.
Oh yeah. If he was on a plantation as a white male, even adolescent, I am sure. Or even after that, but certainly he had the formal plantation pre-Civil War experience as well. Lots of armed resistance from black people this week. That's great. That's why that right there, I would say, if you read, and particularly if you can dig and get some of the books that are not very popular, that are not going to be on Oprah's book wish list. That's not a diss at her. It's just I don't think she's going to have a book like that on her wish list. But there are lots and lots of examples of black people who have absolutely picked up the gun and not been about, turning the other cheek and forgiving and all that. They have been about the business of liberation. And if that means so white people got to go, well, then let's get to it. Anything else? Everybody good? Right on. I assume folks are good. I would say if you are interested, if you're learning anything, if you're seeing some value from this text, I would encourage you just kind of do a Google search. You don't have to make it anything intensive, but just see, what has popped up. Like if you check the news to see what has popped up from week to week, just when we do the readings, because I suspect his name is going to be mentioned a lot, probably at least for the next month or so, because in South Carolina, people are connecting the shooting to Ben Tillman, because as I said, they have been trying to get his statues removed, failing, but trying for most of this year and even some of last year. And I mean, this has been going on for a while, but it's just been getting a lot of attention over the last year or so. But a lot of people are connecting Ben Tillman and Dylan Storm Roof. So things are coming up. People are writing about it in South Carolina, talking about it. As I said, his statue at Winthrop University was vandalized this week, so you can kind of check and see what's happening. That might be good, and particularly to see the white people, what they're saying, white people, when they defend and give the reason why these statues should stay and why Tillman Hall should remain on the campuses of Clemson and Winthrop universities. Check that out, because I think that probably will reveal something as well. Anywho, we'll be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Pacific. Looking forward. We will have a guest from Ireland. 2 guests, actually, a white woman and a black male from Ireland. That will be Monday morning. It'll be way early Monday morning, but we'll give the details tomorrow. Tune in for that. We should have some other things coming down the line for next week as well. We are investing for the summer of 2015. Invest if you think the program is constructive. We're fundraising for the summer of 2015. Invest if you think the program is constructive. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Racism-notes.blogspot.com. Listener supported, counter racist radio. PayPal is in the top right corner. If you're not into PayPal, drop us an email and we will get you a physical mailing address. Thanks to all the folks who have invested and supported down through the years. Really appreciate it. Got my spiffy new microphone. Really appreciate that as well. And just hope the program has been worthy of your time and energy. Remain safe if you're going to be out and about this weekend doing anything. I do not encourage taking vacations under the system of white terrorism. But if you're going to be doing all that, remain codified. It is not no time under white terrorism can we afford to be lax and just think that we're having a great old time and whites will not come and immediately take our lives and or cause us just unnecessary and ridiculous problems, wasting of time and energy. If you're going to consume any alcohol or intoxicants, definitely codify that. Definitely not being behind the wheel. Get to one spot, stay there, see if you can coordinate and everybody stay at the same spot if you're going to do something for the weekend, and then that way everyone can leave maybe the following day once they've sobered up, and that way it won't be any troubles out on the road. Enforcement officials are going to be out heavy until Monday, sobriety checks and all of that. You already know this, and particularly in areas that have a high concentration of black residents. So I would keep all that in mind. If you're going to go out to do any parties or anything, I would be very mindful. I would not want to be in an environment if it's going to be a lot of white people who are intoxicated. I also wouldn't want to be in an environment if it's going to be victims and it's going to get non-constructive. I would watch that as well. If you are going to be out, be constructive, enjoy yourself, but just make sure that you remain codified. Again, sobriety would be best under conditions of war. That being said, thanks everyone for tuning in. We'll see you in about 24 hours. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest levels of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed.
I'm a victim, brother.
Problem. You're a victim.
I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning.
Shut up.
The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.